I'm Marc Weber of the Computer History Museum, and I'm here on the 28th of November, 2023, and we're here with Caroline Rose, who's a pioneer of modern technical documentation, and I'm interviewing her with my colleague Hansen Sue. Thank you for doing this.
Sure. Thank you.
So let's start at the beginning. What's your full name and when and where were you born?
Well, my full name now is Caroline Rose, but I was born as Caroline Rufolo in New York City back in 1947, February 22nd.
And tell me about your family.
Well, that actually is significant. Because my grandparents all came from a poor part of southern Italy and came over here on the boat to Ellis Island. That's how we ended up in New York. And they were really interested in making their fortune here and having their children do well. And their children wanted their children to do well. So I was always pushed to succeed. That really had a big influence on me. My father was actually also born in Italy. He was conceived here, and then my grandfather, his father, had an argument with his boss and went back to Italy. So my father was born there, and then they came back in 1911. So
he was a dual citizen then, or no, he didn't choose to take Italian citizenship.
He was an Italian citizen. Yeah, he didn't. No, he didn't. Yeah, he was born there, so he was an Italian citizen. Yeah. And I wish I could be one, but apparently it goes down the matriarchal line, not the patriarchal. So I'm just an American.
And you were born in New York, Manhattan, or where?
No, Queens, but it was a big point with us that it was New York City, but it wasn't Manhattan. In fact, I lived most of my life in Queens Village, which was just on the edge of New York City, just before Nassau County, and that was important to me. I really loved New York City, loved Manhattan, which is where my father worked. So I admired him, and I admired that city a whole lot.
What did your parents do?
My father was a newspaper man all his life. In fact, he didn't even finish high school. He got his greater education later, picked it up here and there, including in the Army. But he lied about his age and started working as a young man during the Depression as a copy boy, and he never left the New York Daily News. Eventually became the head of their library. And my mother was a registered nurse.
And did you have brothers and sisters?
2 sisters. One older one who was born in 1943, and then the younger one unexpected much later.
And so describe your childhood. What was your neighborhood like? What did you want to be when you grew up?
Well, it was a beautiful neighborhood then. From when I remember on, which is when we moved to Queens Village. That was the one on the border that I mentioned. And it had stately elms, which are all gone now, thanks to Dutch elm disease, and it's a much different place now. But back then, it was mostly people, you knew their ancestry and their religion. That was the big thing. They were mostly Italian Catholics. There were a few, maybe an Irish Catholic, maybe a German Protestant, but we ruled. And there were a lot of kids my age. I didn't get to mingle as much with them as I wanted to when we first moved because I had rheumatic fever as a child, and I wasn't allowed out of the house very much. And I know that also has a lot to do with what I ended up becoming. I don't think I aspired to do anything in particular except I always wanted to work in Manhattan. My father would sometimes take me there, and I thought it was the most exciting imaginable city. And we were heavy readers in the family. We were the family where the four of us, because my younger sister came much later, at the dinner table were mostly all reading. And because of my rheumatic fever, I also really liked math a lot. But I'll get into that more. You'll probably ask more about all that and how that developed. But in terms of what I wanted to do, I didn't really know other than I wanted to work in Manhattan and stay in New York, which I didn't.
And describe your school experience. What were your favorite?
Yeah, that's very interesting. Because of the rheumatic fever, I didn't spend a lot of time in elementary school. My parents hired a tutor for me because even though I didn't feel sick, and maybe I felt a little tired, but I basically felt okay, I still wasn't allowed to move. I wasn't supposed to tire myself. So I couldn't really get out of bed. My father would even carry me up to bed at night. So that meant no school except this tutor, and the tutor tutored me only in math and English. So even to this day, I'm not very good, and I'm not very knowledgeable about history, geography, and all the rest. It was math and English because that was what I needed to pass tests to do well and ostensibly do well. Although I think a well-rounded education would have served me better, but that was it. And when I wasn't being tutored, I was teaching myself things without realizing it. But since I couldn't go out and play the way everyone else was doing, I would read. I loved logic puzzles. I taught myself chess, Scrabble, which I still love to this day. Just used my mind all the time, and really ended up, all throughout my life having good focus and really loving math and English. So that was a big influence on me in grammar school.
And so you moved at what age?
Moved from Jamaica, where I was born. It's also in Queens, but closer to the city. That was an apartment in Jamaica, and I was, I think, 5 years old when we moved to Queens Village. And I started in a public school, but my mother wanted me to go to a Catholic school. And when she was able to move me to the Catholic school into second grade, it was too easy for me. The public school education was so much better that I didn't belong in the second grade in the Catholic school. So after I memorized a prayer, that's all I had to do, they moved me into the third grade. And I started young enough that I started high school at 12. So.
And how many years were you being tutored then?
Well, I had 3 rheumatic fever attacks, so it was like 8, 10. Ones at 8 and 10 were the big ones. 12 was a little less. But it was almost a year at a time, as I recall. My mother, I think, was a little overprotective. I kind of blamed it on her being a nurse for a living. And she really didn't want to take any chances. So I feel like I ended up being tutored for at least 3 years, on and off. And I was in school, I didn't like it as much. I didn't like being taught by the nuns. Didn't suit me, but I had to do it, so.
So you would go in and out of, when you would have the attack, you would be tutored at home.
That's right.
But then you would go back to school.
That's right.
For a period.
Right.
Okay.
So I was really, even I think then, and it certainly carried over and has a lot to do with who I ended up being, I wasn't used to socializing with other kids very much, other people. I was kind of shy, withdrawn. I had one best friend, and that was really all I needed. And we got to be so close because she also had rheumatic fever. She gave me all her Superman comics, and that was a real bond between us. So
How could you see her in person frequently? Or?
I could, because she lived only a block away. She was pretty much the only one I saw while I had rheumatic fever. And the rest of the time when I was out there, I wasn't very popular because no one wanted me to be on their stickball team or anything, because I was never allowed to be active. Even when I wasn't being tutored, I was still being affected by the rheumatic fever in terms of being held back. And that carried on into high school when I wasn't allowed to have gym. And that's why I'm making up for it now. I'm extremely active now. But back then, it was all, hit the books and have Gloria, my best friend, come over, and I wasn't really allowed to do too much else.
And did you like your tutor? Did you get along? Or?
I did. I loved math and English. Something about my mind, and it still is this way, but I liked that they had order and structure. You learned a formula in math, or you learned a grammar rule. I loved diagramming sentences. And then you could just, stick in values, and you got the right answer, so to speak. And I thought that was so easy and interesting, as opposed to having to memorize other subjects like the soft sciences. I remember in grammar school, history involved reading a chapter, because it was taught by nuns who weren't really, I think, good educators especially. Some were. And then you had to memorize a nutshell, they called it, at the end of every chapter. There was no discussion, there was no interest, and I thought, this is boring. But math and English.
Do you still remember which prayer you memorized?
I think it was called the Apostles' Creed. It was a strange little prayer that you wasn't like the Hail Mary, or we knew those from when we were knee-high to a grasshopper. I think it was called the Apostles' Creed, and I couldn't remember it to this day. And that was even hard for me because it was pure memorization. I didn't like memorizing.
Because that sort of goes into, given that your mother wanted you to go, I assume your mother, you said, to the Catholic school, was religion or was politics a big part of your family life? Or?
Religion was. Every Catholic family was a very, very big thing. And you'll hear when you ask me about my later life, it actually is indirectly what pushed me to come to California. But it was very big. And I had a very big family. My mother was one of 12. My father was one of maybe 8, if there were a few who died, but it was around that same size. And we celebrated every single religious or even quasi-religious occasion.
Saints' days.
Yeah, pretty much. I look back on those parties with great joy, because really they were a lot of fun. And I missed that after I left New York. But it did play a big part. And my mother especially, I keep saying that because my father didn't really enter into that. And I even, because of my mother, I had to go to a Catholic high school. So but religion was a big thing. Politics, not so much. You didn't talk about that, but you talked about religion a lot.
And values, ethics that came out of any of that?
Yeah, and you have to memorize your catechism and be a good girl in thought, word, or deed, which instantly started me out as a rebel. I didn't get it. I didn't get the thought or word part, and I would ask questions. Even then, I guess I was kind of analytical. I remember in grammar school, I would ask questions that they didn't think I should ask because they couldn't really be answered. Like, if Adam and Eve were white, where did black people come from? And I even had questions about the Immaculate Conception. I just said, this isn't really computing for me. I didn't use that word, of course. So I think having a strict Catholic upbringing really does lead one to say, wait a minute, and to push away, and that's what I do. That was the effect it had on me.
So talk about high school and...
Yeah, high school. So I had to go to a Catholic school, and this is also largely because they separated girls from boys in elementary school, they did, and I had to go to an all-girls Catholic high school. My mother didn't want me mingling with boys any more than necessary. So there was a Catholic high school in Flushing, which was also in Queens, that was an annex, Bishop McDonald High School. I went to for 2 years, and then for the last 2 years of high school, I had to go to Brooklyn, which was, as I recall, well, it was a very, very long commute. Bus, several trains, wasn't conveniently located, just so I could go to the Catholic school. And I still didn't much like being taught by nuns. I enjoyed teaching myself more than I enjoyed being taught by them, except for my geometry teacher. I loved geometry. I just loved solving theorems, proving theorems. That was so exciting for me, and that was the one, they had these tests called Regents, the state Regents exams. I got 100 on the geometry Regents exam. Big point of pride for me, but also my mother, it's always my mother. My father just said, I just want you to be happy, all my life. But my mother let it be known early on that I was going to do really well in school, that I was going to go to college, that I was going to graduate with honors, that kind of upbringing. So I was very proud to bring home my 100 score on the geometry Regents. In English, I got 98.
But there's still room for improvement.
And she complained. I don't want to make her sound that bad, but she did say, how come you didn't get 100 on the English? Mom, I'm doing my best. And I don't think they gave Regents in anything else. I mean, that's why the tutoring was so significant. I always tested, I did well in tests to determine where I would go from wherever I was, because it was always in math and English, thank God.
And did you, the nuns were not mean, though, or were they?
Oh, no. They were kind of mean in grammar school. You'd occasionally get smacked with a ruler or something, but it wasn't that bad. And then by high school, I think they were already being told, don't do that, because they were nice enough. But as I said, I only realized later when I heard about how people are how they're being taught in modern times, and I didn't have any of that. It was more or less just you get the book, you read the book, and you're tested on what you read in the book, and it wasn't made very exciting. So that the excitement I got was from the subjects that were my two favorites. The rest I thought was pretty boring. And I thought it was pretty boring and not being able to go to a public school where I could maybe have some. I was 12 when I started. I was starting to get interested in boys, and there were no boys around. It was all girls. But I made some nice friends, and high school went well enough. And I almost remember her last name, but because it was a small school, I scored high relative to everyone else. And Alice, somebody or other, she got to be the valedictorian or whatever the equivalent was. She was the highest, and I was right below Alice. I didn't really like Alice very much. But so I did well in school. I was kind of making up for lost time, enjoying, it helped to have competition of other students and try to beat them like Alice all the time. I always wanted to do well. I was told I was going to, and I tried really hard and succeeded in high school.
And sometimes people would go to strict schools, rebel by being wild in their off time. Were you starting to?
Oh yeah, I did, but not at 12 quite yet. At 16 when I started college, it hit me then. And also, school changed a whole lot. Should I skip to that, or did you want to ask me?
No, high school, any particular favorite teachers? You mentioned the geometry teacher.
Yeah, high school was just a geometry teacher. I don't remember anything else. I hated that I couldn't take gym. I was always set apart from everyone else. I was shooting targets with arrows, and everyone else was playing basketball and having a good time. So I was still socially backward.
But you were doing archery, or you're?
That's because it wasn't strenuous. So I did archery and anything where I could just stand still and not do much. And I was always interested in music. I had And I wanted to study a wind instrument, and my mother said that's not going to be good for you
Because of the effort of.
because of the effort. And then I said, okay, violin. And she thought that would be too much, just holding the violin up. So I took cello. And
Because you can sit down, but yeah.
yeah, because I could sit down and didn't just do this. But the music teaching wasn't that great either. But it did get me. I loved music, of course, because I was a math lover, and reading it and all that was fascinating to me. So I've been a musician ever since, but with different instruments. And as soon as I was able to, part of the rebellion thing was I took a wind instrument. I played flute for about 15 years. I said that, So rebellion was a big part of my life, but not in high school. It was more when I was starting college and beyond.
So anything else about high school before moving on?
It's all a blur.
And I mean, I'm assuming that you weren't exposed to computers in college.
No,
then.
you'll be surprised when it finally came in college. Yeah. Not at the beginning. So because of my good grades in high school, I got into a really good school that was free. It's free admission now. I don't mean money-wise. I mean anybody can get in now, but in those days it wasn't. And I was really fortunate to be able to get into Queens College at the City University of New York. And it was a no-brainer. I knew I wanted to major in math. And I loved college. There were not many girls in the math classes, and I still felt very competitive. I tried very hard to keep up. And I remember the shock, though, of being the second highest grade in my small high school and then going to college and going, oh, this is very different. This is a whole new world. I had to work a lot harder. And I certainly wasn't second highest in my graduating class from college. But I did well. I did graduate with honors. But so math was very hard after a while, not in the beginning. And I remember when it got to solid analytic geometry, which I think was in my junior year, I was finding it hard. And I was also starting to wonder what I would do for a living, because I really hadn't had a clue. But no one ever advised me about it, and they weren't very good with advising people then. I mean, I didn't even know there was such a thing as an advisor until someone foisted one on me. I think it was at the beginning of my senior year. And that was the first year, so that I graduated in 67, so it must have been 66, I think was the first time Queens College offered a programming class, and I took it, and it was a 1-credit course in Fortran. And you could go out of your way to look at the computer if you wanted to, but you didn't see the computer. You got a coding sheet, and you were told what program to write, and you wrote it, and you handed it in, and then they would enter it into the computer, and you would be given it back and told if it worked or not. And I thought that was just for idiots. I mean, I just could not believe it. Here's solid analytic geometry and a Fortran program to add numbers or something. And I thought, what? So I didn't want to get into computing. I thought it was just too simple-minded. Oh, I never was good at seeing the big picture of things. I just thought, that's easy, this is hard. But the math was so hard that I wasn't, and I knew I didn't want to teach because I was too shy. Speaking that's not my thing. I'm speaking in public. So they advised me to consider getting into either accounting or statistics. So I chose statistics and thought that was a little bit more interesting. And I focused on that. And I continued not to have much of a social life, except some of the friends in my neighborhood. It was, school was very serious as far as studies went. I probably couldn't have afforded to be in any sororities, but they wouldn't even have let me in because the school was, I don't know how they got away with this, but it was mostly Jewish children, and they were allowed to be in the sororities, but if you were not Jewish, you couldn't be in a sorority. You had to be in, I forget what they called it something else. And the boys wouldn't want to go out with me because they were mostly Jewish, and their mothers wouldn't want them to go out with someone who wasn't Jewish. So I didn't really fit in there either. So, and I liked all those people, but I didn't mix with them much. So I just hung around the neighborhood with Gloria and a few of the Italian kids in the hood. And it's like leading two different lives. I'd hang around with them, and it was very different from when I was hitting the books and studying in school.
But so they were still in high school. You had gone to college early.
Yeah, I went early, and they just didn't go to college. When I was going to college, they would start getting jobs. I was also the first in my family, in my generation, to go to college. It was not common then.
But I mean, your first 2 years of college, a number of your friends were still in high school.
Right, they were still in high school, yeah.
And when you said you started to rebel in college?
When I started in college?
No, you said you started to rebel in college.
Oh, yeah. Well, probably around the time I started. It was the 60s, and I was still going to church because I was expected to, but I wasn't really into that much anymore. And, people were starting to smoke pot. And again, it was the neighborhood kids were like that. But I also had a very serious, studious side. So I was split between the two. And I really wanted to see a path to getting out of my home environment at some point because my mother was so strict. She was trying to control who I went out with, how long I was out, and I was letting her because, she had been my nurse for all those years, which is, I think, one of the reasons that I always did what she said. I followed her instructions. So when Gloria would say, "What do you mean your mother won't let you go out on this date because you didn't behave? Just go anyway." And that was inconceivable to me, which also leads up to how I ended up coming to California, but we'll get there. So I needed to figure a way out, and I knew that if I got good grades, I'd get a good job, and I'd make good money, and I'd eventually have enough to escape. So that was really my motivation for doing well, was to get out of there. Oh, I also didn't mention that, I forgot to say that I also really liked Latin, which I had to take as a Catholic girl, and you had to, so you would understand the masses, which were being said in Latin. And that really tied in with my love of English and gave me a real appreciation of roots of words, and I was even more fascinated by language when I did that. So... But
Vatican II was the early 60s, right? The
what?
Vatican II, when they made the Mass.
Right,
but it took a while.
It took a while. No, I think by the time they were saying it in English, I wasn't really going anymore. I remember it always being in Latin and understanding it because I had to study Latin. So, but even now I benefit from that. I always did, understanding the meaning of words from knowing Latin. I recommend it for everyone, but it's not really done anymore. So there I was in the college where I didn't fit in, and so gave me much more opportunity to buckle down and study. And so I graduated. Oh, I did make the mistake of taking a few soft sciences in my senior year. I thought, criminology, that sounds interesting. Sociology, sure. And that's what brought my grade point average down. My first C's, so I graduated only only cum laude rather than many of the higher ones. But my mother said I would graduate with honors. I did it. I fulfilled my obligation. And I'm not sure how this really fit in, but I know I was expected to get a good job, but I was also expected to get married. I'm not sure how that was all supposed to fit together, but you'll hear how it turned out when we get past college.
And I mean, by this time, the counterculture was starting up in
New
York City as well, to some extent.
Oh, yeah. I mean...
So you're going to parties and...
Yeah, everybody was smoking pot, and nothing worse, but parties and still being good Catholic girls, but really liking disobeying Mom in some lesser ways, like lying about, saying you were with a girl. I would say I was staying overnight at a girlfriend's house. This was a big move for me because I so feared my mother would find out that I was doing these things. But you would each say you were staying at the other one's house. And one of my greatest adventures was going on, I think it was a 50cc motorcycle over the 59th Street Bridge. Maybe it was 90cc, but it wasn't much bigger than that. Sitting on the back of it, no helmets or anything, going into Manhattan to a club that I didn't even realize at the time was some kind of gay dance club. I didn't find out even later what it was. All I know is it was great dancing and great music, and you'd stay till 4 a.m., and you'd come home the next day, and I'd tell my mother I'd been at my girlfriend's house. Oh, that was great. So I had fun, but I was being careful. I've always been kind of wanting to party and have a good time, like my neighborhood friends, but like my college friends also really wanted to do well and stay on the path that would lead me to the success that was so expected of me.
And what music did you like at that time?
Oh, what didn't I like? The music was fantastic then. I mean, I knew every Shirelle song by heart. I still know all the words to them, and I'm still now I sing and play guitar, but and not that music. But I loved all the music that was popular then, which was Motown, and I loved to dance all my life, but it started when that music hit, and how could you not dance? I mean, that's what we did. And we even had groups, well, it was mostly the boys, quartets, singing on the street corner. So at one point, the girls and I formed one.
No.
What's that?
Not barbershop, then.
Oh, no, not at all.
No.
No, like doo-wop.
Motown. Oh, good. Yeah.
And at one point, the girls tried to form their own. We called it the Four Flirts. And it never really developed into anything. We didn't have enough range, but the boys had like a falsetto and a bass and everything in between, and they were good. And that was the big thing to do then. That and drive 57 Chevys, and I really liked those cars. Well, that was when I was younger, I suppose, but they were still popular, even in the 60s. So yeah, I had a lot of fun, but I never let it interfere with my studies, and it was a balancing act. And that's really how I've always been. I've never really changed from that. Good balance of fun and work.
Moderation and some things.
Moderation was important. Really. Yeah. Otherwise, you go too far to either of those camps and the other one suffers, and I didn't want either one to suffer.
So once you had graduated, you were free, or could be free.
Could be. Well.
Oh, and sorry, I guess in college, though, there's...
Yes.
Did you change directions in your studies at all? Or?
It was math from beginning to end. I did, as I said, take a few electives that were not in my field at all toward the end, to the detriment of my grade point average. But no, I never changed direction, but I never knew what I wanted to do for a living, except not teach. So that's why my opportunities were so limited.
And any important mentors or professors?
No, surprisingly.
That's fine.
No
and
mentors at all.
Computing, it didn't grab you at that point.
I thought it was for morons. I mean, imagine. I keep thinking about, I'll never forget how I felt when I hit solid analytic geometry and said, oh my God, so math can be very, very hard. And at the same year, I'm taking a 1-credit course in Fortran. The fact that it's 1 credit tells you how simple they even knew it was. That was all they had.
Because a normal course there was how many credits?
3. So it was, one was like nothing, and it was nothing. So
you didn't dream your career would be in the computing industry?
Not at all. Not in a million years, except, well, do you have any more questions about college specifically?
No, that's the...
Okay, so the exception is that the first job I interviewed for, seriously, or maybe even the first one at all after I got out of college, was at IBM. It was known to be a good place to work. I needed to make money if I could get away from home. And it was to be a technical writer at IBM. And I didn't pass the test, which I think is so funny. It was kind of essay-based, and I was nervous, and there was a time limit, and I was overwhelmed. And I was in upstate New York. That was overwhelming in and of itself. I had to take the railroad up there, I didn't really want to work in upstate New York. I wanted to work in Manhattan, as I said. But I think it's pretty significant that I failed IBM's technical writer test, given what I ended up doing for the rest of my life. But I also interviewed to get a job at Bankers Trust. I think that would have been more in like statistics. And they rejected me because of my heart murmur, not because I'd had rheumatic fever. I was well over that. But I had a slight heart murmur, which I was born with, still have, and, I'm extremely physically active. It's never hindered me in any way whatsoever, but they were an insurance company, and I didn't pass their requirements, so I didn't get that job. But I got a job in Manhattan with a very small statistical research firm called Market Statistics. It was a couple of Chinese immigrants, the Hongs, and maybe no more than half dozen other people in one room in Manhattan. But I was thrilled to be working in Manhattan. And the room was mostly taken up by a huge card sorter. And this was my second exposure to computers after that 1-credit course in Fortran. And it still didn't impress me very much. I guess different companies filled out questionnaires, and these cards were punched and fed into the machine, and I never had anything to do with that. I just analyzed the statistics that came out, and they'd publish reports, and that was that. But I was happy to have found a job in statistics. I didn't have to be a teacher. I was making reasonably good money, which I remember was $5,000 a year. And the emphasis on money was not only because it had always been drilled in me that was an important thing to do, but my mother told me that I do believe, although none of my cousins were told this, and my mother didn't tend to lie, but I think she told me it was an Italian custom that she would dock a third of my salary. She would keep it until I got married, and then I would get it back. So, that was the plan. That was the pressure to get married. Now, when I started working in Manhattan, I started saying that my goal was to be a playgirl with a penthouse apartment in Manhattan. Now, really, something in the Village would have been more appropriate than a penthouse apartment, but I really started thinking, I'm going to be the Manhattan gal. I'm going to have a job in this city the way my father did. I adored my father. I was closer to him because he wasn't so strict, And there I was for June, July, and part of August, living the life. And not too happy about my mother docking my pay, and no intentions of getting married, and still not sure how I was ever going to get away. Gloria didn't...
But you were still living at home at this
Yes.
point. Okay.
Oh, yes.
You didn't get the apartment, even if it wasn't a
Well,
penthouse.
not in just a couple of months, but that was the goal. And I didn't quite see how I was going to with this, my pay being docked. It was only $5,000 a year as it was, and my mother was taking, again, Gloria probably would have said, why do you let her do that? Because she had more freedom with her parents, and she was a lot closer to moving out. She wasn't getting her pay docked, and they were fine with her moving out. My mother, I don't think, wanted me to move out. She didn't want me to get in any trouble. That's the marriage thing was part of the Catholic thing, don't mess around with these boys, just marry one of them. But that wasn't going to be my path. And then my boyfriend from 4 years ago when I started college, my childhood sweetheart, he had gone in the Navy when I went into college. And he came out of the Navy when I got out of college and looked me up, and we started seeing each other. And that changed the course of my life. He had studied electronics in the Navy, and he had seen San Jose and some more of the Bay Area, but mainly San Jose. And he bought a VW Bug for $2,000 and was going to drive it across country, return to California, go to San Jose Community College. And he thought California was terrific. I remember specifically he would talk to me about the roads. He turned out, I realized later, it was the fairly new 280 freeway that he became enamored with because there were all these potholes in New York. And here was this luxurious, beautiful highway with trees all over. And he just fell in love with California, and he intended to go back to California. This was in August of '67 when we were seeing each other, and he was going to go to school, I think, in October, is when the quarter started. And he surprised me one night, and we were parked in his VW Bug, and he got out this little pad of paper, which I saved for many, many years, and it said, Pinky, that was my childhood nickname, Pinky, I've done this math. Math always appealed to me, And he said, I could work part-time while I'm going to community college and work during the summer, and if you came with me, you could work. He wanted me to join him in this adventure. And I thought, this is the ticket out. Oh, and I should mention, '67 was the summer of love, which we heard a lot about in New York, as what was happening in San Francisco. And all right, there was, do you know the way to San Jose? And if you're going to San Francisco, be sure to wear some flowers in your hair. And this was very appealing to all of us, but none of us were about to go over there. That was just, it would be way too much, so far away, and it's a whole other world. But, and this, my Chris, the boyfriend, was very straight. He was just out of the Navy. That wasn't appealing to him. But he loved these other things about California. And I liked both aspects of it. I thought, yeah, I can get away. I can probably get a good job there. And there's a lot of groovy people over there. It appealed to me. And I didn't like the idea of leaving Gloria, my best friend, but I felt it was the right move for me, and I was still fond enough of him and kind of talked myself into being fond enough to do this with him. But I also, well, let me put it this way to make it a little bit more dramatic. That night, because he was in a hurry, I asked my mother how she would feel if I married Chris, and we went to move to California.
And get the third back. Yeah.
And she said she wanted me to get married, and it fit the plan. She wasn't crazy about me moving. I wasn't crazy about that aspect of it in some ways either, because I did like some things about family and my friends, but I also like California. So she said yes. And the next morning when I told Chris, he was surprised. And I was surprised that he was surprised, because I said, well, my mother's always liked you. I remember being surprised by him not expecting that reaction. Turns out he was surprised because he hadn't proposed marriage, but I didn't find out he didn't tell me until 3-ish years later, that he didn't realize how controlled I was with this scenario of getting married. He was suggesting that I just accompany him over there and live with him for another 4-year hitch, as he put it, like the Navy. But I thought we were seriously getting married. So that was why he was surprised, and it was all an accident, really. In fact, if he had said, I didn't mean to get married, I wouldn't be where I am today. But he went along with it because he wanted my company that much. It wasn't really because we were so madly in love with each other. What did we know? I mean, I was 20, but I was a very young 20. So I was very slow to mature, but I think it has a lot to do with what I told you about my background. So he said, okay, and I overlooked that he was surprised that it was okay, and then even the night before, he was saying, so Pinky, you don't think this is going to necessarily be forever, do you? And I said, well, of course I do. And I attributed it to cold feet. So that's how I got to California.
So you got married?
Got married rather quickly. He suggested the idea in August. We got married in September, and we were out here in October. And he immediately got a job at, that was the beginning of the whole thing for me. He got a job at Tymshare as an electronics technician. That was a part-time job because he was going to San Jose Community College. And they needed a technical writer. And I had no idea what a technical writer was, but I knew I could write, and I knew I could understand technical stuff, so I interviewed with him. And purely on the strength of my strengths in math and English, I got hired by someone that I'm eternally grateful to, Neil Sullivan at Tymshare. Figured I could do the job. And so that's how I got started.
So we've interviewed Ann Hardy, Norm Hardy, and Leroy Times for TimeNet.
And who else?
Leroy Times.
Oh yeah, Leroy. Nice people. I liked them all. They were brilliant.
And I didn't, that was me and David, or were you those? I don't remember. But there were also earlier, was it Sullivan? I'm forgetting the name of the co-founders, but.
Well, there was Dave Schmidt and I'm forgetting his name too. Oh, O'Rourke.
Yeah, and I think.
Forget his first name off.
So
Tom O'Rourke.
In the early 2000s, the Corporate Histories Project here interviewed both of them, I believe.
Oh.
So we actually have. So I realized you were with Tymshare later, but I didn't realize you were there, fairly early.
Oh, I'd love to see that. That's
we'll
ancient history.
Cross-reference to the. So talk a little bit about Tymshare.
What year did you start?
I started in December 67. Actually, my first day was something like December 27th or 29th, right at the very end of the year.
And they started in 65 or something?
Yeah, something like that. It was still pretty new. It wasn't a big company where I was, the technical hub, but they did have people elsewhere, like sales and all that. I didn't see any of those people. But the office where I worked, which was on Bub Road, was, it seemed like no more than a couple of dozen people, as I recall. And, I could talk about that, I guess, how the job was. So because it was such a small company, to me, it seemed, there was no orientation. And what did I know about computers other than my one credit Fortran course and the IBM card sorter? That was it. Well, that didn't bother them, and it didn't bother me because they showed me, first thing they showed me was an editor how an editor worked. And I remember my first thought being, editor. And I thought an editor would be something that, to me, an editor massaged something already written. And here an editor is, you actually enter text with an editor. Okay, well, I could take that. What kind of text? I barely knew. I figured they were coding, but I made a point in the manual, which I brought with me, and to refresh my memory, what did I know then and what didn't I know? They wanted me to say, you can enter any text at all, but I'm not sure what other context there would have been other than code writing then, because Tymshare did have the ARPANET, but no one was you weren't allowed to use it, except under very certain circumstances. So it wasn't as if people were writing things, chatting with each other over the ARPANET. So I barely knew, I could barely grasp the concept of an editor or what you were editing. And I wasn't using a computer I wasn't using a Tymshare system to write the documentation. I could see how it worked and check it out on there, but I was writing in pencil. And it was transcribed by a guy in the production department, and he typed it up on an IBM Selectric typewriter. And in a later review of some of my documentation, they praised the fact that it was two-color. This was very big. So what the user typed and what the computer replied with were in different colors and made it really clear. That was the big innovation. But going back to when I just started, so I'm kind of not knowing what's going on, but I'm certainly able to explain how the editor works and start writing the manual. And I was there for maybe, could have been up to a month, I hate to say, but I was there a while. When the guys there were super friendly and very helpful, always willing to share their knowledge. And one of them came in one day and said, "So, would you like to see the computer?" And I was so ignorant that I didn't realize that the Tymshare terminal was a terminal and not a computer. And I said, "This isn't the computer?" What did I know? So I said, "Sure, I'd like to see the computer." I mean, I kind of got that you dialed in with a modem. Tymshare's slogan was a computer at your fingertips. And I knew that what I was doing was new. As far as I knew, and I could be wrong about this, but I think the only company doing it that we knew of anyway, that I knew of, was GE. And I knew of no existing manuals that were explaining how to use computers for ordinary people. Maybe I was certainly one of the first, if not the first, to do it in Silicon Valley, and that was exciting. But to make the connection that an ordinary person was using it, and sort of they have these little computers. What exactly was going on, I didn't quite get until that day when he said, "Let's go look at the computer." And it was right across the street on Bubb Road. And I remember crossing the street, and the entire building across the street was filled with the computer. It was huge. And it was noisy. They had all these fans. And the other thing I remember is behind that building on Bubb Road, including where Apple would later be, was a huge, beautiful apricot orchard. And in the spring, it would all be white flowers, and it was just gorgeous back there. So it was kind of the country. There was the Tymshare where we worked, and then operations was across the street. And finally, I got the whole picture and realized that was the computer. This is the terminal. And so that's how I started out, not knowing a single thing.
And you were writing the user manual.
Yeah, I was writing user manuals.
Tymshare for the editor.
Right. And for something called the executive, and I don't have my full list handy, but it was that kind of really easy, high-level documentation for users. And
so the executive was like a shell or a command line?
Yeah, it must have been. I don't have that manual anymore. I donated something or things here, and I don't remember Somehow I've lost a few of the early manuals. I still have one, though, so I hardly remember what the executive was, but it must have been that. But I found it so easy that I was kind of twiddling my thumbs, wanting to learn more. It was as easy as that one-credit Fortran course was, but much more interesting to me to be writing documentation. But I still wanted something more complicated, and these guys, they were all guys, as I recall, who were programmers, were willing to help me. So I was very excited to learn first assembly language, and then Fortran, and it was such a small company that they had me doing minor work on these applications themselves, like bug fixing or maybe implementing something small, quality control. I got my hands into the programming itself while I was writing user documentation. And
sorry, but were you writing it early enough in the process, like if you found something that didn't work well or didn't make sense, you could tell them and they might change the program?
Well, I certainly did a lot of that later. I probably didn't do that yet in the first year or two, but I did later on. But at that time, I was writing about very high-level stuff and starting to program at a very low level, so the twain didn't really meet at that time. And I realized early on that, well, I was the only technical writer, and there was no path for me. I was considered a glorified secretary. The reason I mentioned that I made $5,000 in Manhattan at that job is that my job as a technical writer started me at $7,000. I knew this was a land of opportunity right then. But to get past that was going to be difficult because there was no path for me as a technical writer. And I was learning programming, and I thought, I guess I should become a programmer. So I did. Tymshare was a great company to work for. And one of the ways they were was that you could pretty much do what you wanted. They always went along with what I wanted to do. They kept me happy. And so when I said about a year and a half into the job, spring of '69, that I wanted to be a programmer, they said, great. And I was taught on the job just by all these helpful programmers there, willing to share their knowledge, and it really wasn't so hard that you couldn't just explain it to me on a whiteboard and I'd get it. Everything was just line by line. The most complicated thing was a go-to, it was really not that hard, and I found it fascinating to put it all together and write actual code that people were going to use. So instead of just modifying programs in my spare time, I was writing them or parts of programs in my full time. As a full-time job, except I probably even then still was being asked to write some documentation, but for 7 years after that, I was mostly a programmer. And I started at the applications level. I wrote what I call a paper tape package, whatever that means, something to do with paper tape, and a statistical package. I actually wrote a couple of high-level things myself, but then I wanted to go more deeply into it. So after about a year of that, I became a systems programmer, and being very, very detail-oriented, I was thrilled to be assigned interpreting formatting strings for Fortran. All those little characters in these strings that had a different meaning in terms of how numbers would be formatted. I loved that. And so there, I would be assigned parts of the Fortran compiler to write. And I really liked that and did it for, as I said, 7 years. And
And over that period, Tymshare expanded the software that it offered.
What's that?
I mean, over that period, Tymshare was expanding the software it could offer to clients, right?
Right. Now, again, being mostly someone who looks down at the detail level and not at the high level, I can't tell you much about what they were doing, but I do know that we moved from the SDS 940 computer that was our computer to PDP-10 to the XDS Sigma 7, and they also started, like I remember, basic to super basic, and there was I programmed Fortran in a language called Simple that I think was of our own creation. So yeah, there was always new stuff coming up, and that's one of the things I found exciting about doing the job, is being able to stay on top of what was happening technically. And it was manageable to me for those 7 years until it became unmanageable. It started getting a lot harder and a lot more complicated.
And who were the main people you were working with or for?
Well, they were all programmers. There were no other writers, as I recall. I don't recall there being any other writers. There may have been, but I didn't work with them because by the time I was only just a writer for a year and a half, and then became a programmer. But Richard Moore was an early one. Arden Scott. There's so many. I mean, I could just name all but I mainly learned from Richard Moore, still a good friend. Anytime I got stuck, he would write things out on his whiteboard, and I'd understand what to do. Frank Brasher, he's probably no longer with us. And those were the two main people I worked with.
What was the corporate culture like, company culture?
Very nose to the grindstone, but also we had what we call Building T, the tap room, which was right around the corner. It's actually in the town of Monte Vista. Bub Road is kind of at the end of Cupertino, and there's a little town called Monte Vista. And it was just known that on Fridays everybody went over to the tap room, or else they went to the park and got high, or both. It was. So we had that, but at work, very nose to the grindstone. Really a bunch of hardworking people, probably working already more than 40 hours a week. I would say they were a really good bunch of conscientious, hardworking people who were. The thing I found fascinating about them is, even though they probably all had computer science degrees, they would turn me on to interesting literature. They were very well-rounded in their education, but when you weren't working, you were having fun. It was. I thought it was just great, and everybody was friendly with everybody else. I don't remember any friction or, it was just a happy company and a lot of really competent people there.
Did you work much with Anne Hardy or Norm Hardy, or did you?
Not at all.
Knew them?
No, they were like the company geniuses that we just, like our gods, But they were always doing stuff that was more advanced than what I was documenting. So I didn't. But even though I wasn't, they were super friendly and approachable. I mean, I was on very friendly terms with Anne and Norman Leroy and everybody. That's the kind of company it was. Even Tom and Dave. I mean, you just everybody mingled with everyone. It was almost like a flat hierarchy in a way. You never had any problem with bosses or anything. We just all were very excited about what we were doing.
And I remember Anne telling the story of I guess one of the co-CEOs or whatever didn't believe she had written the operating system.
Oh.
And thought that it was Norm.
I'm not surprised.
Until she went into the hospital to have her first kid. And something broke, and the guy called Norm, and Norm's like, I don't know, that's Anne's thing.
I love that story. I did listen to all of her interviews.
But I mean, what was it like? I mean, women were, obviously there was Anne there and you were a programmer, but I mean, what was it like being a woman in that environment?
It was kind of like when I was taking those math classes in college. It worked in my favor, though, because I think they all liked, I was kind of a novelty or something, and, you know, really enthusiastic and like a sponge, really. Wanted to learn whatever they wanted to share. So that worked out really well. There was no competition and then there came in, I think, another female programmer, as I recall. So it was starting to change, but it was I've really never experienced prejudice in the workplace because I'm a woman. It's always either worked in my favor or I was just considered an equal. I think in that case it worked in my favor. It was kind of this cute young thing, you know, like, oh, teach me, and they did. It worked out well for them, because they knew they were passing on their knowledge, and it really worked well for me because I was able to learn how to program without needing a computer science degree, because it was easy enough at that time. And when it started getting too hard, which it did, is when I stopped being a programmer.
Could you describe like how it got more difficult?
Well, let's see. I was 7 years as a programmer, and one of the things that while I was programming, toward the end especially, I was still occasionally being asked to write. And I remember a significant milestone was Magnum. It was originally called Midas, and then changed it to Magnum. And it was a relational database system. And suddenly everything is not just line by line, do this, do that, go here, go there, maybe an occasional for loop. It was really object-based. And I was asked to write, while I was programming parts of Magnum, I was also asked to write the documentation for it. And that was a whole new world, which I found both exciting and intimidating. It was exciting to learn about it enough. I always had to learn about it pretty deeply to write the documentation. When it came to the coding, I think I was starting to get a little intimidated, and I was beginning to see that computer programming could be pretty difficult after all. That was about when. I can't tell you the details of why I felt that way, but I did, because I remember saying to myself as I was making the decision to go back to writing full time that to stay a programmer, I would have to keep learning new languages. To be a writer, I had a language I'd mastered, and I didn't need to learn any more languages. I would get to learn about all these new products. I wouldn't have to learn new languages. And I was also beginning to see that as computer programming became more specialized, that if you would probably get to work on one thing for a very long time if you were a programmer. And I thought that wasn't as interesting as being a writer, and just moving on to the next exciting technology and learning about it and not having to get that deeply into it seemed perfect. So that was when I decided to go back to writing, and Tymshare and its beautiful acceptance of whatever you wanted to do that you were good at. I said, sure, and didn't cut me back down to a writer's salary, because they realized at that time that it was important to have someone writing documentation for developers who actually had programming experience. So I think the smartest move I ever made in my career, and other than smartest pre-career move to actually come to California, was to actually be a programmer for a while, so that I could more deeply understand whatever I was going to write about from then on.
And they had enough need for writing by then. I mean, you could do it full time. Were you the only writer still? No.
No.
There was a
No,
team
in
by
fact,
then, right?
I wasn't anymore. And I don't remember the other writers that well, but I remember not being happy with what they were doing, because it was very hard to find a writer with programming experience, and I didn't like that they didn't quite understand what they were doing. And so I was the senior writer, and by default, by the way, I should say, I was never edited. That's one of the things I loved. I didn't need an editor. I didn't have an editor. I just did good work, and that's what went out. So I ended up being the senior writer, sort of looking at the work of and editing the work of other writers, and I was never quite happy with it. And I can't really remember who they were, but I know that didn't thrill me. And then because, well, I don't want to skip too far ahead, but so I'll just leave. My mind is going too many years ahead for now.
What year did you go back to technical writing?
Well, I started in 67 to 69 and was a writer, so it was 76. Now, 76 I went back to writing, and and that was about when the graphical user interface was being developed at Park. And I found out about it in 77, through a guy I was seeing who worked at Park, who said one Saturday, let's go over there and play a game on the computer. And I thought, well, that's a crazy idea. And he was so excited about it. And again, lacking a big picture, I didn't quite get what the implications were, that you could draw things on the computer. I didn't quite get that at all. And I should also mention my father and mother both worked one place their entire lives, and I thought I would be at Tymshare forever. Talk about lack of big picture. So around this time, in the mid-70s, people were leaving Tymshare for Apple, which had moved half a block away. I shouldn't say moved, that's where they were. And they were just, one day on their lunch break, go down there and chat and end up getting a job at Apple and leaving. So I saw this computer at Park around that time, and I played Hangman on it. And he was so excited, and I thought, well, I could do this faster on a piece of paper. The whole big picture of graphical user interface, people going to Apple, personal computers versus Tymshare, still wasn't enough for me to think that I would ever leave Tymshare. And so, anyway, I also then, about a year later, Tymshare acquired, in 78, Tymshare acquired Doug Engelbart's group, and I started getting a little bit more of an idea of what could be happening in the future. But the mouse was a very awkward thing. That's when I first used a mouse. And again, I always loved learning new technology. It was exciting from that perspective, but I still didn't quite get the implications. The mouse was awkward to use. It was kind of a big wooden boxy thing. And I had no interest in using his keypad.
You would use the Xerox. If you went to Park, there might have been there were the 3-button mice at Park.
Yeah.
But it might not have registered.
Yeah, he was controlling the computer and just showing it to me, so I didn't really use it. But in Doug's group, it was something else entirely. I mean, I wouldn't even remember, except I have a photograph of me using it, and it was kind of a big boxy thing. And, probably know about his keypad idea. I never subscribed to that. Didn't get that either. But
you did use the augment system that Doug
oh
developed.
yeah, and I documented some augment documentation, and I loved the people in the group. They also were a real happy, brilliant bunch of people.
So Harvey obviously, Harvey Laitman was there. Who else do you remember from that?
Well, yeah, very significant was Dirk van Neuhaus. He was a writer there. Oh, Sandy Miranda.
Yeah, right. I was going to ask you I think she talked about you in her book, I think.
Yeah, probably.
Yeah. But yeah, Sandy Miranda.
Yeah,
Who else?
a lot of, Nina Zolotov. They were just, I can't remember any more names offhand, but I worked, what I really liked was that I got out of the Tymshare environment, physical environment, moved to Menlo Park because I started working in their Menlo Park building because there wasn't enough room for the group to work in Cupertino, in our Cupertino building. And I remember my excitement about it having windows you could open, and I was always very environmentally conscious, and I hated the fact that there was, when they started having cubicles instead of offices, it's a terrible thing for a writer. No writer should have to work in that environment, but that's how it was. And it was always too cold, you couldn't control the air conditioning, people smoked like chimneys inside. It was horrible, and I was so thrilled to go to the SRI office in Menlo Park. It was completely different. It was, and you could let in fresh air, and it was just a fresh, new beginning for me to be working with these interesting people on these. And they were very excited about what they were doing. They got the significance of it more than I did, just typical for me.
And that started in 78.
78.
But
Yes.
I don't think I realized that when they went to Tymshare, Engelbart's group stayed physically in Menlo Park.
For a while.
Because Harvey talked about walking across that orchard to Apple.
Yeah, then they moved.
Okay, right.
But
at
for
the
a
beginning,
while,
they were in.
Eventually, yeah, they needed to get more buildings before they could move those people over. We were already.
Okay.
It was
So
already
they were
full.
acquired, but still in their own.
Right,
office
still in their own
space.
building for a while.
And you had talked in some interview I found where you talked about using the ARPANET early on.
Oh yeah, way back.
But at Tymshare?
Timeshare.
Okay.
Yeah.
And doing what with it?
Oh, sending little love notes to. You weren't allowed to, but I was going out with someone in operations. And I wouldn't even remember this, except I kept a journal at the time. And, there was this yellow paper tape that things would get printed out on, and I would have little notes that I would save because they were so sweet. And if I was out of town, he would send me a little. We would communicate that way. So, yeah, I used the ARPANET illegally, probably, but everybody would sneak in and use it now and then.
Because they had a connection. And then they had their own TimeNet, of course.
Right,
later.
right.
But you weren't involved with TimeNet particularly.
No, I didn't really have much to do with that.
Because that split off in the late 70s.
Yeah.
And Norm Hardy talked about, one of his regrets was that they were overpricing Augment. He used to chat with Doug, but he felt that Tymshare was selling Augment at such a high price that it kind of destroyed the potential market.
Yeah, that could be. I didn't know that. Excuse me. I never understood why more wasn't done with that. It just seemed like it didn't really fit ever. I didn't know about the high pricing. It was kind of out of that part of the loop, but we didn't seem to take as much advantage as we could have of what was going on in that group.
Did you feel some of the tension, though?
Did I what?
Did you know there was tension between Doug and?
No, but I always had the feeling it wasn't a good fit. I didn't sense tension. I never did. Until until around the time I decided to leave. And that was part of why I decided to leave, but not the main reason. They kind of, after I was in the augment group for a while and really enjoying it, I hit another salary wall, and I was Peter Principled up to management. I became a writing manager. And that really it's not a role that I'm best suited to. I really kind of want to do hands-on work. And there was tension then. It was definitely not I didn't have that flat organization feeling that I did before. And at least they kept the writers, they kept me and my little writing group in the software group, because we were writing developer documentation. I thought that was really important, and that would change over the years in other companies, and I'm sure it's not done now. But I was still tight with the programmers, but there was more tension. There was who was going to get what cubicle, who's going to get the corner cubicle, and it was a bigger company by then, and there were some tensions then, but I never sensed tensions between the Tymshare core and augment. I just knew nobody really knew what to do with it. That's what I thought. Didn't know it had to do with money. I mean, that was one aspect of it that I didn't know about, the price.
And you mentioned various relationships. So by this time, were you divorced?
Oh yes, I should have mentioned that. Yeah. Well, it was only another 4-year hitch, as he had intended. So by 71, that was over. Yeah.
Okay. But what did your family think about?
Oh. They weren't happy. My father said, whatever makes you happy. My mother didn't like my being divorced because she was, because of the Catholic thing. And they both were disappointed that I didn't come home. But I was really into what I was doing by then, even after only 4 years. I really knew this is where I wanted to be. I liked California a lot, but it was mainly the work. I thought, wow. I mean, I didn't mention this, maybe it goes without saying, but I felt like technical writing from the beginning just fit me like a glove. I didn't want to work for IBM. IBM was the enemy. So I wasn't going to go back to New York and work for IBM. They didn't want me anyway. They rejected me.
But so that you really moved to programming just because there wasn't that much more writing work.
That's right.
But then the programming served you very well when you went back to
That's
writing.
right. And then they kept asking me to write, so I was able to say, which one do I want to do for full time?
It's a good combination. I mean, it's very rare to find technical writers. So.
Right. Well, we're leading up to where that's going to be very significant. Should we go to the early 80s? Yes. So I became this writing manager in 81, and as I said, there started to be tensions. I wasn't happy with who they gave me as my manager, I think, at that time. And writers under me, I wasn't really happy with their work. And as I mentioned, for years, even before then, there was this migration from Tymshare to a half a block away to Apple. So as I was in this management job, the Macintosh was being developed down the street. And I was still thinking, I'm going to work for Tymshare forever. Just not really using my head the way I should have, get up from the detail level and say, wait a minute, what's happening here? But fortunately, Dirk Van Neuhaus, who was one of the ones who went to Apple from Tymshare, he knew my work, and he was in the Macintosh group. No, he was in the Lisa group. And Steve Jobs had a writer working on the Macintosh developer documentation that had no programming experience and wasn't doing a good job of it. So he wanted to find someone else. So he made an announcement to everyone in that building, and I think it was Lisa and Mac people, saying, does anyone know a good technical writer who has programming experience, who can do a better job on the inside, I don't know if it was called that then, but on the Macintosh developer documentation. And Derek said, yes, Caroline Rose. I think I was Rose. Yes, I was Rose by then. I changed my name after I got, well, it was a thing to do to change your name to names of flowers. And actually, Rose had become my middle name when I was 12 years old and had a Catholic confirmation ritual. So I decided to make it my last name.
But you had taken your husband's name when you...
Yeah, Caroline Deal. At Tymshare, I was Caroline Deal. And then I wanted to change it, but I thought, well, and this was the feminist thing. I said, I don't want my husband's name. I don't want my father's name. In a way, I kind of now regret that I didn't just take my father's. I liked Caroline Rufolo. That was a good name. Flowed off the tongue, and I loved my father, and I was really close to him. But I kind of said, no, I want my own name. And people were changing their names to names of flowers and rainbows and rain and everything else. So that's when I became Caroline Rose. So Derek
that
said,
was when, after your divorce?
Yeah, after the divorce. So...
Oh, because you had to change. If you didn't want to keep your husband's name, you needed to change to something.
Yeah, I changed it legally, too, because I wanted to get a passport, and I took my first trip to Europe, and I wanted it to all be straightforward, and so I made it a legal change. And so Derek gave my name to Steve Jobs, and thinking I'm going to work for Tymshare forever, for better or worse, I got a phone call from Chris Espinoza, who was the manager of documentation, inviting me to come for an interview. I did forget to mention that I had interviewed at Apple once before, but the reason I didn't is because nothing came of it. It was when I was making too much money for them.
But that was for the Apple II group,
For the Apple II.
So
the Apple II group was...
How much before do you think that was? When, roughly? 2 years before or something?
Well, yeah, it was probably in sometime in the late 70s, when there was grand migration from Tymshare to Apple. I actually, maybe it was 78 or something like that. And I loved the people in the group, and they loved me, and they said, God, you'd be a great fit, and it'd be just fantastic. And I even got clear that since I'd been at Tymshare so long and had a lot of vacation, that we can work that out. And everyone was great with it until I talked to the manager. And I remember that number, too. It was $30,000. And she said, oh, that's way too much. We can't pay you that. Goodbye.
A lot of money back then.
So I really didn't think it was that much. I mean, it was less than the programmers were making. It was a good writer's salary. It was very, very decent, but it was more than anybody in that group was making. But the people in that group hadn't the programming experience that I had. So I thought I was worth it, but they didn't. And I was fine to go back to Tymshare. I figured, okay, this is my life. But when they called me, I only got called to join the Mac group because of my programming experience. So that's why that was had been such a smart career move that I'd made before, not realizing how smart it was at the time, but just did it because that was my interest. So I walked down the block to be interviewed, and they showed me, it's probably Andy Hirschfeld that showed it to me, balls bouncing on the screen, I remember. And they were so excited. And I had the same reaction I did when I was playing Hangman on the Alto computer. Like, well, I thought of it kind of as a toy. I didn't quite get how that would translate to anything useful. But I thought it was pretty exciting anyway. Not because I saw where it was going, but that's pretty cool, balls bouncing on the screen. Okay, what do you want me to do? And then, write the documentation. And I really didn't like being a manager at Tymshare. As much as I was married to that company, I did decide to leave, and it was in June of '82 that I accepted their offer. But first, I remember the day after the interview, or actually right after the interview, I went back to Tymshare, and one of the programmers was my good friend. He said to me, how did the interview at Apple go? And so I told him about the balls bouncing on the screen. And he shut the door and said, didn't they have you sign an NDA? And I said, what's an NDA? They didn't. And he said, I wouldn't think you'd be wanting to say this. So apparently it was, a big news that they were that far along. No one had told me not to tell anyone. So that's when I got the picture. Oh, okay. And it made me even more excited about it. Ooh, this is something no one's supposed to know about, and I'm going to be working on it. So I took the job. They were willing, salary wasn't an issue. They really wanted someone who could understand the stuff, and that's how I got to writing Inside Macintosh at Apple, in the glorious Mac group.
And Chris Espinosa, you were working for him.
Yeah, the first thing I did, as kind of like a test, he gave me, and I still have it, he gave me a printout of a manual that he had written, core edit. And he said, wanted me to give my opinion of it. And I did what they call, though it wasn't really a red pen, I just used a pencil, but I bled all over it. I had problems with it on every single page. And he loved it. He was thrilled that I'd caught so much that I could improve. And so he knew I was going to work out. And I kind of knew even before that I was going to work out. But as with any new technology, as excited as I am to learn something new, especially if it's brand new, like when Magnum Relational Database, it had that same feeling. It was brand new. People didn't program that way before. And with a Mac, they didn't do event-based programming before. So that was both exciting and intimidating, because when you have to document it, you have to figure out how to explain. First, you have to understand it yourself, and I insisted on understanding it thoroughly before documenting it. I'd always been that way. But you had to explain it to programmers in a way that would be easy for them to make the same transition. And in fact, I had named a chapter early on in Inside Macintosh that was, I think I got this from my good friend Scott Canaster. I think I got the idea. Everything you know is wrong. They made me change it to a horse of a different color, but the whole idea was this is a whole new world, so you have to change your thinking. So that was really fun and a little bit hard, but I managed it.
So, Jeff Raskin had started documentation at Apple way back, right?
Yeah.
But then Chris Espinosa was the head of documentation for the Mac team.
For the Mac,
but
yeah.
there
and
was
I
a
never,
whole different documentation
I never
group
even met Jeff.
in Apple.
Yeah.
But for the Apple II, they had their own whole separate team.
Their own whole separate thing.
For documentation, yeah. And you had no dealings with them.
No, but Sandy says we crossed paths, so I knew the people, but I didn't work with them until way later, when the Lisa group disbanded and they were all available to work on Inside Macintosh. I knew the people in the Apple II group, but I didn't work with them. They were completely separate. They were in a building across the street, and there was a huge rivalry between us. We had a lot of perks that they didn't have. Free this, free that, whatever. Steve always he coddled us, keep us happy. I didn't submit to much of the coddling because I'm a nose to the grindstone, totally focused, leave me alone kind of worker. I think in retrospect to my detriment, because I probably should have socialized a little bit more. It would have worked in my favor. I think that some of them maybe thought I was unfriendly or whatever, but I really had to keep my focus to do it all. There was tremendous pressure. And I wasn't willing to work 90 hours a week. So that's why there was even more pressure on me. And in that sense, I had to get a lot done in the 40 or maybe worst case 50 that I was willing to work a week. Whereas the programmers, some of them were just living there practically. I really needed a good work-life balance, and I didn't work. When Steve Jobs handed out the 90 hours a week and loving it sweatshirts, I gave mine away. I would never have loved working 90 hours a week. But I'm glad those programmers did. They worked hard and they were terrific, and they were always willing to give me their time, and they were always not only patient, but happy that I would insist on understanding everything down to a really low level, because I would change their thinking about how to write the code just by asking them about how certain cases worked. Even when I was a programmer, I was always thinking of edge cases and finding bugs in edge cases, like the 0 case or the -1 case or whatever. I was asking similar questions, and they would say, I guess I didn't think about that one. And they'd go back, and it was really a great place to work. I really loved doing that.
Was there a rivalry with the Lisa team as well?
Mm-hmm. They knew that we were his pet project, and that Lisa was. I mean, we borrowed from them, but there was definitely you could call it a rivalry, except it was always clear that the Mac group were the favored few, as it were.
So more envy than rivalry or resentment, or yeah.
It was more resentment than rivalry, I think. It's because those perks that the Apple II group didn't have, and the Lisa group didn't have either. I mean, the Mac was considered very special, and that's one of the things I loved about it. I always preferred small companies, and it felt like a small company. Again, it was like maybe at most a couple dozen people working really hard together, and everything else was invisible to me and to them. We just did what we were doing, and yeah, it was like Steve's little. In fact, I think even Chris might have even said something like that to me during the interview. That he definitely had the feeling it's almost like Steve starting a little company within a company, and I loved that idea. And of course, I was excited to work for Steve Jobs. I didn't know much about him other than what everyone else in the world knew, and I thought that'll be cool too. In addition to everything else about this job, getting to work side by side with him, because he was very much there, intermingling with everyone.
And what was that like?
With Steve, it's always both heaven and hell. I mean, enough has been said about him, and it's all true. He had great ideas. It was stimulating to talk to him about how he wanted to do things, and his ideas were terrific. And of course, he didn't code, but he would inspire the programmers. He was great in terms of inspiration and motivation, but the means, I really didn't care for the way he would berate people, if he didn't like what they were doing. He was really harsh, really caustic. He knew he could get away with absolutely anything, and he took advantage of that, and I didn't care for that. I wasn't used to that. There was none of that where I came from. Was not used to it. I hadn't seen it before, and I haven't seen it since. So, he was very tough and very rude at times, and but then he could also be, especially if you were playing ping pong and just hanging out with him afterwards. When I didn't do enough of that because I'm a nose to the grindstone thing, but if you were willing to hang around afterwards, and we had a ping pong table and other ways of playing, he could be very sweet and charming and likable. But I knew from people like Dan Kotke that he was not to be trusted, and there was always a two-edged sword with him.
And were you ever on the bad side of...
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I think it started when... At first it was fine. I mean, he was happy to have good documentation. And Chris was smart enough to release the documentation. Each manager, like the control manager or the dialogue manager, would release it in just that section in a preliminary form, so developers could get a head start, so that there could be some software to ship with the computer.
Internal developers, I mean the programmers on the...
What's that?
When you say developers, you mean the programmers within the team, or outside, within the team?
No, the programmers within the team knew how to do it. No, I'm talking about the outside developers who needed to they wanted applications ready by the time the Mac shipped. So they needed the documentation. Everyone internally kind of just talked among themselves, knew how things worked. They just, I don't know how they read, I suppose they read it too, but the focus was get it to outside developers.
So like Microsoft and other third parties?
Uh-huh. Yep, third parties. And but then that was when I first became the subject of Steve's wrath was when he wanted the documentation faster than I was able to write it. And it wasn't just because I was not working 90 hours a week, but it was because the software kept changing. And he was unhappy that it wasn't, Inside Macintosh wasn't going to be completely final when the Mac shipped. That was completely impossible because the software was changing up until the last minute. He was unhappy, and many people in the company were unhappy, that we didn't have sample code. How can you write sample code when the software isn't stable yet? And my team was only so big. I wasn't going to have writers that couldn't write. There were only a few who really could. Fortunately, I had some of them on the team. For a while, I guess it was mostly just me. Maybe Joanna and Chris did some user interface guidelines, but it was me. And then and there was someone working on hardware because I didn't do that documentation. And then I managed to get some other good writers, but we were totally just trying to figure out how this all fits together, and checking with the programmers constantly on what they had last changed. There was no way we could write sample code. Not even, tech support would write sample code, but it would be temporary. That would change too. So that was another complaint. That was when I first heard from Steve. Maybe it was even indirectly through Chris, although Steve didn't pay any attention to the org chart. I'm sure he must have blasted me a couple of times too about that. But I was very confident. I knew I had to do a good job and that I couldn't do a good job if I was going to rush it, and you get what you get, so hold your horses. Oh, he was also furious that I didn't start writing the documentation on the Macintosh sooner. Oh, God. I couldn't believe that. The Mac was barely ready to write anything on, and he wanted me to start writing it. Oh, he wanted me to move it all to the Mac. This is when I have time pressure to finish the documentation. I said, that is not going to happen. I was using an Apple III. And fortunately, they agreed to let me hire someone, and she ends up being significant too later on. Luella Pizzuti was just a crazy young kid out of college, not knowing what she wanted to do, and she took on the job of converting what was almost all of Inside Mac by then, because quite a bit of it was written by then. When I had time pressure to finish it up and I was not about to convert it, she did that job while I was finishing up the documentation. But it still wasn't ready at ship. But preliminary versions of everything was ready, and then the entire thing came out later. The whole, was it 1,400 pages or 1,100, I forget, but more than 1,000.
You wrote a 1,400 before.
Excuse me?
You had written 1,400, I believe.
Yeah, 1,400, that's it. I wasn't sure if I sounded like an exaggeration, but that is it. And I edited all of it, which means anything anybody else wrote, I wanted to have the same quality as what I'd written before and the same basic structure. And I got a little pushback on that when the Lisa people who had their own ways of doing things, especially the really good writers in that group, like Steve Chernikoff was one, he was really good. And they had different ideas about how to do it, and I'd already written more than half of it. So I said, no, you can't do that. It has to be like this. I wanted the consistency. I wanted the same consistency from chapter to chapter as Steve Jobs wanted from application to application, which makes me laugh now because one of my problems in learning new apps is there isn't much consistency anymore. And I like consistency. So I had rules, and I loved writing guidelines and style guides, and I had an actual document that said, this is how you write the Inside Macintosh documentation, and that's just it. And I edited all of it. And
where did that come from, though? Were you drawing on your experience at Tymshare, on things done by the Apple II or the Lisa group? And where did you set your initial style guides from?
Well, I just always knew how I wanted things done, and I had never been edited, and I was always in charge of my own writing. And so when I got to, whenever I was the lead writer on something, I guess I also was always a kind of a consistency freak in a way. I mean, I think that has to do with liking rules and why I was attracted to math and what I said before about English. This is the formula and you get to plug stuff into it. It wasn't that rigid, but there were certain rules, and English has a lot of variations in terms of what's correct, and I couldn't stand inconsistencies, even in spelling of a word differently in one place than another. And for some reason, I guess because of that focus I had, I could remember in the whole 1,400 pages when something was inconsistent. And I guess not everyone thought that was so important.
Could you talk about how Inside Mac was organized and how that came about?
Well,
the process of developing just the strategy of how that.
That's a good question. See, since I think I attribute this partly to my programming experience and wanting to learn things the way a programmer would, I came at it not knowing anything and observed the process by which I learned it, or what I needed to know about it and how I figured it out was when I joined the Mac group, I would learn about things at a very low level with no context or very little context. Hardly knew what a control was when I was writing the control manager, for example. But as I became familiar with all the low-level details, because I'm a bottom-up kind of person, so I would learn the low-level details, and suddenly I started getting this picture. And then I would see the structure for how to put these pieces together. And then I would see the big picture finally. This is what it's all about. Aha. And all the documentation I'd ever written had been written that way. I would never write the introduction to any book, manual, whatever I was writing, in any other way, because what do you know? Until you understand it down low, you can't really say what it's all about. So I did that, and then I organized it in the opposite direction for the developers. They could benefit from my having seen the big picture in an intelligent way, rather than just say, "Oh, it's for these controls that you mess up." It was more specific. Here's what controls are. Here's what dialogues are in a broad sense. Then the next section would be an introduction to what was to follow, which was at the very lowest level. So it's kind of between the two. That just seemed the way to do it to me, because that's how I learned. I learned it the other way, and I knew that wasn't the way they would want to learn it. So I organized it that way because I figured it would be the best way for it to work. And here's what this is about. Here's how you're going to fit all these pieces together that I'm going to tell you about. Then I would give them all the low-level details, and then a quick reference summary for once they did know it and they just had to go back and get a quick reminder. So it was just the way I learned it, and I figured that would work well for them. And that's how I wanted it done, so that's how I did it.
Yeah. Could you talk about, both from your experience learning it, but also in terms of how you approach teaching other programmers, how did you approach the difference from regular sort of just linear types of programming to this event-driven model, which is very different, right? Very hard to wrap your head around when you're used to just writing a program straight.
Well, that was the hardest thing about it. And again, it brought to mind when I first had learned Magnum and object-oriented programming, and that was a whole different paradigm. So, I'm not sure what I can add to saying how I approached it other than what I just did. Once I got it, in fact, it was possibly after I wrote all the individual chapters that I was able to write, here's what event-based programming is all about, because then I really got it. It all happens backwards for me, and then that horse of a different color chapter was probably one of the last things I wrote, because then I fully understood how it was different. And I think some of the programmers, from what they told me over the years, and they still sometimes write to me and tell me, is that I've always, I think from the first days at Tymshare, always would write the way I would speak to someone. So they found it easy to grasp that way. It wasn't, even though it was technical documentation, it wasn't written in a technical way. So it was written in just simple language, and I would just try to explain it the way I had finally figured it out in the end. And that seemed to do the trick. I always approached it really just from how I was able to figure it out. But again, usually at the very, very end of my process would I be able to do that. Otherwise, it would just be gibberish.
You were playing with the software as you did this. And, I mean, what was your process for learning about?
Well, it was mostly not playing with it because I couldn't do any of the coding. I was just, programmers would give me the low-level details about how the things worked without even then I didn't, and they wouldn't often tell me the higher level because they were so familiar with it, I guess they didn't even think of explaining it too much. That would be something I would ask. But I would get the descriptions of all the routines and told, like that second level of documentation, second level higher up that I said I would then do would be how it all fit together. And the way I really learned a lot about it was, I kind of pretended I was programming in it, and I would find problems. They're just cases that they hadn't thought of. And I loved when Andy Hertzfeld was interviewed, and he said he realized that if he couldn't answer one of my questions, he'd have to go back and change the software and then say, here, okay, here. So it was all in my head. I couldn't program it. I didn't have that. I didn't have access to that. So I just figured it out. And for all I know, I might have even written down a few things to see if I understood the order in which they'd be called, but I never got to do any of that myself. It's all hypothetical. But in my head, hypothetical is not at a high level. It's at a very low level, including cases that no one else has thought of, because that's somehow how my mind works.
And when the Lisa group came in, when that was when they ceased to be, can you talk, is that in the right order?
Well,
chronological.
So a lot of them didn't have programming experience, and I can't remember if they moved on or if I wanted them to move on or both, but there's a lot of credits in Inside Macintosh, not many. There are people from the Lisa group, but if it took too much time for me to edit them, then it wasn't really working out. I remember the best one was Steve Chernikoff. He was the one from the Lisa group that really worked out and was a great contributor. And the other ones were able to help, but it wasn't always a good match. But I think by then, I'm not really sure whether, I was going to say by then I think maybe that whole rivalry thing was over, but maybe it wasn't. I'm not really sure, can't recall, but it had been so strong, I can't imagine. Let's just say the taste of it was probably still in their mouths. They were definitely second to us in many ways, and so when they got to incorporate and offered the opportunity to go into the Mac group, I think it probably still didn't feel very comfortable. I liked them all very much, but I also didn't want a lot of writers because it would be more for me to have to control. I just wanted some really super productive writers that didn't need a lot of editing.
You would come back to being a TechPub's manager whether you wanted to or not, right?
Well, not really. So I was in charge of Inside Macintosh, but I wasn't officially a manager until Steve left. And I was told that I was not going to work. I was going to work in a TechPubs group that was headed by, I believe, Chris's mother. I think it was Sue, at the highest level. And I became an Inside Mac project supervisor, and I oversaw volume 4, the first volume after the magnum opus of 1,400 pages. And again, supervising or managing. Managing's even worse because you have reviews of people you have to do and all that. It took me too far away from the work, and I didn't really want to do that. I mean, at least when I was in charge of Inside Mac, I was writing most of the time, and when I wasn't writing, I was overseeing the work of the programmers, the other writers, and I didn't have to do any managerial things.
And how many other writers helped
well,
Inside Mac?
It was amorphous because I think the least of people came and went. The core group was maybe 6, a couple of hardware writers and 3 or 4 good software writers, and then there was a little trickling back. There was some other contribution. There may be 10, for all I know, listed in Inside Macintosh, but toward the end of the list, they contributed a lot less, and I think they were all ready to move on anyway. I think they were just taking that as an interim job before they would move on. And but still, I wasn't officially a manager, I was kind of a supervisor, but really a lead writer and editor is what I call it. Officially, that's all I was. And it was going to be done my way. So in that sense, I was managing it, but I wasn't a manager. And then when I became the supervisor and oversaw Volume 4 and lost so many things, one of the things was my connection with the Mac programmers. Many of them left when Steve left. I didn't like being in a writing group that wasn't part of a software group. I really think that when you're writing technical documentation, you should be embedded in the software group. There wasn't much I liked at all about, it felt like a demotion to me. And so I followed Steve to Next. That's what I wanted to do, to get out of there.
Mm-hmm. That was 1980?
Well,
left.
585, you became supervisor of Mac technical documentation.
Yeah, so I left in 86. And became the manager, but I felt like it was publications, but it was manager in name only. There were only 13 people in the company at that point, and I thought, well, it's just going to be me for a while and 1 or 2 other people. How bad can it get? Well, I did learn how bad it could get, but I left in 86, and I was there for 5 years.
And before moving to Next, so Sandy Miranda, though, she came through the Lisa group, right? Or not through?
She must have. I don't remember. I didn't work with her for that long, but I think she might be in the credits of Inside Mac. I knew her more just to yak with and be friends with, and I don't remember her contribution so much of which group she came from.
But I mean, you knew her at Tymshare, obviously.
Yeah,
right.
I met her through Doug's group, and I'm really, all those people I kind of became close with. In fact, Derek knew me so well because we shared a dark room at his house. I've always been an avid photographer, and we were all very close.
And when you were on the peak of the Inside Macintosh effort, these up 6 or 10 people, were you all physically working together on Apple IIIs, or what? How tightly linked were you day to day?
Tightly working together, in person, Apple IIIs, me looking over their shoulders, and it was a tight group. It had to be to get it done. There was a lot of pressure.
And physically close to the programmers.
Oh, yeah. I was right in the middle of them. I mean, yeah. That's how it has to be. You can't just occasionally walk over. And if there's even physical distance, it's going to discourage you from checking in on how something works. And that was more important to me than anything. And Chris understood that. And I'm pretty sure we were all, can't remember so much about the later years, but we must have all been physically close to the programmers and working in a tight-knit group. It was the only way we could get it done because again, the software was changing so much, and it was not a stable product until after the Mac shipped. So all the software, every single manager still needed tweaking and work. So you had to ask a lot of questions and stay up to date and meet with the programmers a lot. And they were great. They never complained about that. They never thought we were bothering them, as long as we kept asking good questions and not waste their time with stupid questions. So they don't like that, of course. I wouldn't.
So talk about working at Next and developing the documentation there.
And going there, making the decision, or being recruited, or whatever.
Yeah, well, I asked to join his group and went through an interview process. And, Steve Jobs pulls this thing. I know he did it then. He might have even done it the first time he hired me at Apple. Are you the best? That's how he interviews. Are you the best at what you do? Well, by then I could confidently say, yes, you know that. You've seen Inside Macintosh. I guess I bowled him over with that attitude, and that's what he likes to hear. But I also thought it was true. I thought I was pretty good. So one of the reasons he gave me the job so early, because there was nothing to write about for the Next computer yet, is that he wanted to hire these two really good programmers who were working on Right Now. For Macintosh. It was a great program. I loved it. So they were writing that as contractors, and they had to finish that up before they could start working on the Next documentation. And the idea was that Right Now would be eventually ported to the Next computer. But meanwhile, the Macintosh product had to be finished completely before they could turn their attention to Next. So that's the first thing I did there, was write a Macintosh document, the Right Now manual, which I really liked doing.
Did you write it in Right Now, though?
I can't remember. I may have, because it was pretty far along.
But it was written on a Mac.
Yeah. Well, by then, for sure. So I probably did use Right Now. And I was crazy about Right Now. And I was kind of the project manager because there was no one else to kind of see that, you're almost like a project manager if you're doing documentation correctly, because you're not only finding problems with the code, but because of the time pressure and everything, at some point you want to say, can we just stop now and not implement, do we really have to add all these features? So I felt like I was project managing it. I wanted it to be done so I could move on to whatever, to Next. I got to say, honestly, I wasn't that excited about the direction that Next was going to take. I was just excited about working in a new company founded by Steve Jobs. And I knew all the best people were going there, and I thought that would be really exciting, but I didn't quite get his goal all that much. I just had faith that it would be exciting and pay off.
What was the goal at that point? Because I know it changed.
It was, well, as I recall, I may not be aware of the change. I just remember that it was supposed to be for higher education. And it wasn't going to be a really very personal computer because it was going to be very expensive. Kind of knew that from the beginning, because it was going to be very high powered. And it was going to be for sciences and kind of like a tiny supercomputer is almost the feeling I got, but definitely education-oriented, which isn't something I particularly got. But then not being a big picture person, I thought maybe I'm just missing. This is going to be the next big thing. But I knew it wasn't going to be the next big thing with just ordinary people. That was not the target audience. It was educational institutions is what I remember hearing about. And I don't remember that changing. Maybe it did. I always had my head down at the lower level.
But maybe you weren't thinking about it, but there were other workstations at the time that would be Sun and Apollo and all sorts
Yeah.
But were those, the differentiation was the better graphics, the education?
I guess. That wasn't clear to me. That would be what people would mention when I would tell them what next was, or, during conversations with other people I knew in the industry. I'd say, well, how does that compete with? I never knew those answers. I just trusted that the marketing department knew, but it was never clear to me. I guess better graphics and just better because, Steve had all this influence. He could get anything he wanted, it seemed. And I thought whatever anybody else was doing, he could do better through cajoling or whatever. But it was more like blind faith in him that I had in any way.
At what point did object-oriented programming become a main focus for the next platform?
I don't know. I remember it being the way it was. And I don't really recall it being any different. I guess maybe by the time I was done with the Right Now project and there was enough software written by then that's just the way it was, and I can't really recall when it particularly hit. I just know that's how it was, and that's what I had to document and understand, and I'd had some experience with that before, so I was ready for it. But it was a much different environment than all my past ones. It wasn't quite as sweet as working in the Mac group, I must say.
So then right after the Right Now project, you were documenting the app kit and other sorts of kits in the system?
Mm-hmm. And hiring people. That's when I realized, management. That was a real burden. I had to hire first just people to write the developer documentation and then the user documentation, and manage them and write their performance reviews and do a whole lot of other stuff besides actually writing the documentation myself. And it was very different. There would be a lot of, I remember meetings of the software group, and I was in the software group. And there were that important quality of being embedded with them was there. But I didn't have much of a voice, and it wasn't the same kind of chummy, rapport as in the Mac group. And I would be sitting in these meetings listening to them talking about how to do things and mostly just taking it in. And I'm not sure what else to say about that, but I can say why I left, but we're not there yet, I suppose, if you have more questions about what it was like to work at Next. I will say, well, go ahead.
Well, what was the culture like?
Now, that's what I'm trying to say.
Mm-hmm.
Very driven, very hardworking people, brilliant. I don't remember, I personally didn't have the same feeling of camaraderie that I did in the Mac group. I'm not sure why. I don't think it's anything against the people. I mean, they were working hard. But it wasn't, for me, I didn't get the sense that it was quite as playful. And I don't think the enthusiasm for the product was as high. I remember having some retreats where even Joanna Hoffman, as I recall, would be questioning what they were doing, whereas with the Mac, it was all just joy and excitement, and I didn't feel that in the Next group. And yet there was still pressure, so there was nothing to balance it, for me anyway. I just think everybody just was working very hard and were very serious, and it was something about the environment there didn't work for me quite as well from the beginning, and certainly not toward the end.
Actually, I kind of wanted to ask, how would you compare and contrast the Next sort of developer system from the Macintosh?
You know, I had so many traumatic things happen at Next, especially toward the end, that I don't remember much about writing that documentation. It's funny, the Macintosh documentation was so much earlier, and I remember so much about it. But I don't recall, actually, how writing that documentation was different from writing the Mac documentation. I just know that the same excitement wasn't there for me, and it wasn't as, even though it was different in a way, it wasn't as new. So, but I can't remember the particulars of the documentation, to be honest.
Who did you work closely with?
Well, the programmers. My manager was the software manager, Bud Tribble, and I didn't work with him at all. He was just my manager. I didn't. So it was like in the Mac group, just deciding what to do, pretty much how it should be written on my own, and then just trying to get the information from the programmers. And they were very cooperative. But
any particular programmers that you remember working with?
Well, all of them. There weren't that many. Leo Horowitz, John Anderson, Bill Schumi. Oh, another one that I can see and can't recall his name. But that was very similar to working in the Mac group. They were happy to answer my questions. I don't think they needed adult supervision as much as the Mac group did. You know, there used to be this expression about it. It was like a Boy Scout troop, the Mac group, but without adult supervision. And I felt that way sometimes when I was trying to get them to call all these routines by the same name that did all the same thing. There wasn't that same kind of, I don't want to call it chaos. It was actually not that, but things were more, the programmers seemed more together and organized and doing what they were doing and just passing it on to me, and just a pretty simple documentation process.
Right. Was it partly because more of the programmers had research backgrounds or academic backgrounds or had worked for larger companies before?
Well, they all came from Apple.
Had Horowitz come?
Except for John Anderson and Bill Schumi were the ones who were contractors writing right now for Macintosh when they came. But I think
they were the Right Now.
Yeah, they were the Right Now people who then joined the next team. But as far as I recall, everyone else came from Apple, from the Mac group.
Right, initially.
Yeah, so they were used to working together, and they all worked very well together as a unit. So.
And Donald Lewin, you remember him from the...
Yeah, I didn't work with him because he was always in marketing, but he was always a good friend. We share swimming in common, so we used to talk about swimming a lot.
And you knew him at Apple as well.
Yeah, he's a great guy.
And was Steve different at Next, or was he similar?
Well, I didn't work as closely with him for some reason. I don't think he was any different. So one of the differences at Next was we had a building in Redwood Shores that actually had offices, which I was really happy for, but it did create a different feeling. I mean, I could write better in an office, but there wasn't that same spirit of us all working together in the same room that we had at Mac, in the Mac group. So Steve himself, I think he never really seemed to mature a whole lot in terms of, there was still the berating and the ways he would put people down if they didn't do what he wanted to do. But you get used to it after a while, and you kind of expect it. The programmers didn't even really seem to mind that much. They just saw that's Steve doing his thing. And he exaggerated, I think, both his negativity and his positivity at times. I think it was pretty much the same.
So it didn't change one way or another at next?
Not that I can recall, but then it got worse for me personally because I got a physical problem after working there for, very hard for 3 years. I got a repetitive strain injury. And he had, he wasn't patient with that, as patient as I would have liked him to be. He was for a while, and then he just couldn't take it anymore, which is why I ended up leaving. But I was kind of like him in some ways. I didn't suffer fools gladly, and I also complained when things weren't going right. And I would complain to him about needing more help with this problem I was having. And he wanted me to just rest and go away, and I just, have somebody else take over, I guess. And we really clashed a lot. So I got to see a side of him I hadn't seen before, having more conversations with him that were very serious about what to do about this problem. And mind you, he wasn't my manager, but he never really paid much attention to hierarchies, and so it wouldn't be Bud that I would be talking to about this, it would be Steve. And repetitive strain injuries were hardly heard of by then. The word ergonomics was hardly in anyone's vocabulary. So I had been using a computer unergonomically since 1967, writing. And I, by the way, don't type. I hunt and peck, because when I went to school, if you weren't going to be a secretary, you didn't learn how to type. I don't know if that made it worse or better for me, but eventually, using a computer at this height, desk height, caught up with me. And this is all I remember, most of what I remember at Next, other than hiring a couple of really good writers. I had a burning sensation in my hands after a while when I was typing, and I probably should have rested it more than I did, but instead I talked Steve into hiring someone to type for me, and that didn't work very well. She ended up not liking doing it, so then we hired someone else to do that. She worked out better, but still it was untenable. And Steve didn't want to deal with it anymore. He hired someone to replace me and asked me to leave.
And so you left on bad terms with him.
Yeah. See, there was no Americans with Disabilities Act then, so he could get rid of me because of my physical problem. He said that wasn't why. He said something about not liking the direction that the documentation was going. But I had just gotten a really good review from Bud about the direction the documentation was going, so I didn't believe that. And so although the user documentation could use someone with a less conventional approach to documentation than me, it ended up being reshaped to be more super chatty and pretty, and I'm a more serious writer for user documentation. So it did take a good direction after I left. I'm not complaining about that so much as the fact that it wasn't it wasn't all done above board. He didn't say, we don't want to deal with this problem anymore. He said, we're not happy with your work. And I had never been told that in my life. So even though there was no Americans with Disabilities Act, I felt that it wasn't right. And so I talked to a lawyer about it, and he said, well, it's probably illegal, and you could probably prove it because you have this review that says you were doing good work, and he was lying and all that. He said, but he can afford to pay his lawyers way more than you can afford to pay me. So I suggest you go. It was probably a good change. But you have stock that vests in a few months. Tell him you want that stock. Well, that was the best $3,000 I ever spent to that lawyer, because I did say that, and he did say okay. And he said he will say okay because he knows that what he's doing is not right. So I walked away with the next stock that later became Apple stock. And it was a great move in the end for reasons I can get into, but at the time I was devastated. I was
never been told that before.
Crushed. I mean, being told he wasn't happy with my work, but also, what am I going to do now? I can't use my hands, and I'm a writer. I had started a repetitive strain injury support group, which was so novel that it was actually televised. It was on a local TV station, like, whoa, look at this new thing that people have. They also called it cumulative trauma disorders, CTDs. I think it's more known as RSIs. I gathered a lot of research, and I knew there were things I could do that were more ergonomic, but I thought mistakenly that it was too late for me to recover and that my life was over. I mean, I was so depressed, and it was also the first chronic pain I'd ever had in my life. So it couldn't be fixed. They told me at Stanford, and they connected me up with the pain clinic they have at Stanford. And part of what they do there, which is the most helpful thing for me, was they have you see a psychologist who specializes in people with chronic pain. And I remember going in there really depressed. And the first thing I learned was, because I was only in my 40s then, and I thought this was way too soon to be having chronic pain. And he said, do you know how many people are walking around with chronic pain? What percentage of people? And it was something like 80. I don't know what. I was floored. I said, oh, really? Because I had just been kind of a kid before that. It felt like I was no chronic pains, no real serious health issues. But the other thing he said that I'll never forget, and this is where it was good that I was a statistician, that I had been one. He said, well, tell me what you think is the worst case probability for, and he went through this whole scenario. Well, he said, what's your biggest fear? And I said that I'll become a bag lady. And he said, okay, well, what would it take for you to become a bag lady? And he went through all the steps, and he said, just give me your most pessimistic percentage of probability that this will happen. And then he multiplied them all together, and it came out to be a very small percentage that I would ever be a bag lady. And it worked on me. In fact, I walked in there saying, I don't want any touchy-feely stuff. I don't want this hug, this thing, pillow. This is the end of my life, and I know it is, or whatever I said. My usual, that's another thing Steve and I had in common. I do exaggerate a positive or negative direction, and I was really emphasizing the negative then. And I walked out thinking, probably I'm not going to be a bag lady. And then a miracle happened. Word got out that I was looking for work. And I got a call from Apple, the second time I got asked to be interviewed at Apple, from the woman, Luella Pizzuti, whom I had hired to convert the Inside Macintosh from the Apple III to the Mac. She had become the manager of tech support and had started a technical journal called Develop. And she had done a few issues, and she said, I hear you're available, and I think you'd be perfect for this job. So it wasn't the end of my life, and I got through it all. But that's why the whole next, it's like a cloud over my whole career. I can tell you details about pretty much everything else, but what I remember at next is never feeling totally comfortable or that I fit or that it was the same kind of group as, same wonderful experience that working in the Mac group was. And then the departure was hell.
And how did you work, though, after that?
What's that?
How did you write after that? How could you write?
Oh, well, before we get to that, let me mention
Okay.
one more thing. I just remembered that I didn't say it. Steve, at the end, 3 times, because I remember thinking of the cock crowing 3 times, he said 3 times, because of my long history with him. You were there for us when we needed you. We'll be there for you now that you need us. And that's what hurt even more. I shouldn't have been surprised because I knew about his history with Daniel Kotke and other people that he kind of screwed over. So he didn't really mean that, and that hurt. But how I wrote after that was through this repetitive strain injury group that I started, and through talking with Luella about what the job would entail, I realized it could be done. The first thing that would have to be done would be I'd have to have an ergonomic workstation, so I got a platform that would be putting my hands at the right height. But also, since I was the editor-in-chief, I was not writing articles. I was getting programmers to write articles for it, and I was editing, which is much less typing. And I was not a manager, and I didn't mention this, but when I was a manager at Next, I was floored by the amount of time it took to manage, to write performance reviews, and that was a lot of typing. And I didn't have to do any of that. It wasn't a management job, but I was in charge. Perfect for Caroline. So I had 3 people who worked with me, but not for me. And one was responsible for the production, and one was the technical buck stopper, and the other one was kind of an administrative assistant to me, a big help. And Luella was a lovely person, but not super organized, and so she said she would actually sleep in the office when it was time for this quarterly magazine to come out. And the first thing I did, just to make sure that everything would be organized and that there wouldn't be too much pressure on me, because pressure doesn't help when you already have something that's caused by, your body is kind of really tense here. I created a spreadsheet, the goal date, and everything had to be done before it. And everybody would tease me about it. It was, I think, 6 or 8 pages taped together. It was beyond my wall. And it had deadlines for every single step. And she would ensure that all those deadlines were met. I couldn't have done it without her. So all I had to do is create the spreadsheet, and then I just made sure to do what an editor-in-chief is supposed to do. That was really the job. I just loved it because I also have a sense of how I want things to look, the color and graphics and the cover and all that. So it just couldn't have been a better job for me. It was a fantastic fit. And it was really, except for working on Inside Macintosh, the best job I'd ever had. And I loved it, and I loved working with these people. And I also knew one of the reasons I hesitated to take the job was that I knew it wasn't critical to the company, the way everything I'd ever done before was, where you have to have the documentation. And I knew that if things got tight, and Apple, I knew it could happen then, that the technical journal, beautifully produced technical journal, it was a gorgeous piece of work. We hired an artist to do the cover. It was just top notch. I think it won some awards or something. Anyway, it was highly regarded, but totally unnecessary. So that's why I did it for 5 years, and only 5 years, because that was when Steve came back to Apple. But there was a rumor that he would get rid of all unnecessary projects and everyone who worked on them. And that was on everyone's lips before it happened. It was said more than once, and I said, okay, well, develop the technical journal is clearly an unnecessary project. But even though he had, in my mind, betrayed me before, I thought, well, come on, I wrote Inside Macintosh for him. I was the manager of documentation at Next, and he was happy with what I did, and we have a history. He's not going to get rid of me, but he did. The whole team. I didn't take it personally. There were many, many layoffs when he came back, as you may know. Apple wasn't doing well, which was, I guess, why he got called back in. And So I did it for about 5 glorious years, knew it would die, and when it did, I was not as freaked out as I was the first time I'd lost a job, because I'd always thought about being self-employed, and that was my next step.
Could you, before we get to that, could you
Yeah.
contrast what Apple was like and what it was like to work there in the 90s versus the 80s?
Well, I was really lucky, I think, where I was working. It was, I think, in the tech support group, as I recall, and they were a great bunch of people, and they were not as stressed out as the programmers.
So that was developer tech support?
Yeah.
The journal, yeah.
Yeah, that's where Luella had started it. She was, I think, managing the group at the time, I'm pretty sure. And, or she had at least. Maybe she was going to stop then, I can't recall. But they were great, because it's just not as stressful as having to write the code. And they were all wonderful people. And it was a much different environment, but it was no less satisfying and fun than being in the Mac group. In fact, it was a little more fun because it was less stressful. And with my big, huge spreadsheet, I made sure that I wasn't going to have to sleep in the office. In fact, I insisted on taking a week's vacation after every issue shipped. In fact, I asked Luella ahead of time if I could get 4 weeks vacation as part of the condition for the job, and I would take a week off after finishing each issue, and she said, sure. So it was easier, but as much fun. And I think it's because I was in the tech support group. I don't know what it would have been like to work in something more, well, to work in the programming group at the time, in software.
When you say you knew that it might not be forever, I mean, Apple, people didn't see it as going down until the mid-90s, really.
No, but I thought it was a wonder that develop existed at all.
Okay. So
Because
it was not about the company as a whole, just
No,
that it was
no,
an
no.
expensive luxury.
No, not when I first took it, but I recognize it as, gee, they have a technical journal where anybody can write articles and they can be about any old thing, and it had humor. It was fun, and I thought, it seems like an odd thing to even exist. I felt that way from the beginning. But Luella was fun, and I think that's why, my title was editor-in-chief, for example. And Dave, who was the technical, he was responsible for the technical accuracy of everything, Dave Johnson, and he called it, his title, he came up with technical buck stopper, and we had humor throughout, and the developers loved it, but they didn't really have to have it. They learned things from it, but yeah.
So it was distributed to all the third-party developers.
Yeah, probably all the
But
developers.
I mean, I remember those developer CDs that came out. So this
Yeah,
was
it came with a
something being
CD.
Sent with, okay.
It came with a CD with the code that they were describing on it.
Right, so you had to be a member of the Apple Developer Program
Yeah,
to
probably.
receive it.
I wasn't responsible for that end of it.
Right, but it was part
But-
of that package. Of
Yeah, I think so.
developer
I think it was
relations.
part of developer relations, right? So you probably had to be a registered developer. And it was significant for when I became self-employed that some were written internally, but many, if not most, were from developers outside the company. So that gave me a lot of contacts for the future. I didn't think of it that way at the time. I just thought, wow, this is such a cool job. And I'd had a long career up until then, and only doing necessary things. So that just happened to hit me about it right away, that this could be something that someday they'll think they don't need anymore. And in fact, I argued for having it become online only before we got killed. And then especially when I found out it was going to get killed, I said, why don't you just make it online only instead? But they were desperate. They had to get rid of anything they could. So actually it went over to Mac Tech magazine. They put it online. I don't even know if they did future versions. They might have, but it wouldn't have had the same quality. For sure.
But you were taking, a lot of it was articles by developers, but you would select, obviously, right? Because I presume some of them are just trying to push their own, give you their press release.
Oh, yeah, no, we wouldn't let that. No,
So
it had to be seriously technical. That's where Dave stepped in. He made sure that it was something worth publishing. So I would solicit them, and Dave would check them out, and if they passed, it was a go. And
Do you remember like what technologies were written about in the magazine?
well, I have all the issues at home, and I could tell you, but no. There was a lot of graphics stuff. I remember that, but it was all over the map, and there was no sense of having like a particular theme. It was just whatever happened to come in. Which is partly why I can't recall. It was everything and anything, just as long as it was valid and something that possibly other programmers could learn from, then it was a go. But I can't really say much more about what the topics were offhand.
So most of the articles were written by third-party developers, not internal Apple
It was
developers.
both, maybe it was even half and half. And there were regular columns, Q&As. We'd answer questions from developers. And there had to be, because it had to always work out to be the same number of pages, and that was a filler that we could make shorter or longer as we needed. We had that all figured out. What a great experience, putting together a magazine. I loved it. In fact, when I was a kid, we put together very young, a little Queens Village, 218th Street, which is where I lived, little one-page newspaper. And here I was doing it for 120 pages, I think it was, for the Macintosh developers. It was very exciting, having all that control and being able to work on the layout and so on. I loved it.
All right, so we were talking about the Develop magazine.
Yeah.
And the various technologies that were featured in it. So you don't remember exactly which ones.
A whole
That
lot.
was the pen, the early part of that is sort of the pen era with Newton and a lot of that stuff.
There wasn't any of that.
Was it all Mac focused?
Well, it was technically the Apple Technical Journal, but I don't remember anything other than Mac Focus.
So like you mentioned graphics, so like quick draw type stuff.
Oh, yeah.
OpenDoc, was that covered?
I don't remember. But I do know it was always very esoteric. It had to be something that, the programmers didn't want to write about anything other than some serious problem they had discovered that they knew the answer to. That was kind of the bent of it, was if you're having this same problem, you'll be happy to see this answer here. And some were, some weren't, but they all seemed to like the magazine well enough.
So you mentioned you moved, like after that, you worked on the MacTech magazine?
No. After I left, Develop no longer existed.
Oh, right.
And MacTech had it online on their website instead. And I don't recall, when I went on to become self-employed, I stopped looking back at that. But they may have even added to it a bit, I'm not sure.
But MacTech was a third-party magazine, though, right? It was not Apple.
Right, but the
created.
MacTech site had all the develops online.
Oh. And Apple just let them put them on?
Yeah, they must have made some kind of deal.
Huh.
No sense in killing it all. And that's kind of what I had wanted to do, was to have it just be an online journal so I could keep my job, but it's better that it worked out the way it did in retrospect.
And before we move to your freelance career, I did want a couple of things. QA, was that tied at all to the documentation in either at Apple or Next?
No, not that I can recall.
And I mean, I don't think this necessarily concerned you, but I mean, Tymshare was all about connection and networking, Engelbart's group, obviously. The Apple after, I mean, Raskin had a connected vision that got changed to a much more standalone, everything you need is in the box. Next went back to a connected vision. Did you have any, I mean, you went through a number of big paradigm shifts.
Oh, yeah.
But did you have any particular opinion on any of this, or did you think about it? Or?
I never did. I just followed it, learned it, and documented it. And I never, again, because of not really looking at the big picture, I didn't, I mean, I was excited about the idea of the Macintosh being, as Steve used to say, like an appliance, like a toaster. I thought that was a good idea. But usually I just thought whatever I was working on was the coolest thing. And so, except when it came to Next, I had a few doubts, you know, because of the education bent there. I wasn't so sure. I wasn't as excited about that. But I just went with the flow. Whatever they were doing, I was happy with. I didn't really have an opinion about it. I suppose I should have, but.
Why? And then let's see. Were you involved at all? I mean, I was involved. I'm jobs coordinator for the Society for Technical Communication, late '80s into the early '90s. But were you involved? Apple, I don't think, was involved in any professional organization.
No, some of us, including myself, we were members, and they did give some nice awards to Inside Macintosh, and I think maybe even Develop. But I didn't have time to be involved with the group. I was too busy with work and trying to have a life outside of work, so I didn't participate much, but I was a member. Apple didn't pay any attention to it, really. They didn't encourage us to join it or any of that.
Because it's a period when the field really professionalized from, you know, nobody having a certificate. By the early '90s, they're starting to have certificate programs, and it became really a field.
But, you know, I don't know what your opinion was of the certificate program. So I hired a bunch of writers, and I never found the ones who had learned how to do technical writing to be the best writers. I don't want to put down the program, because I'm sure there were some really good ones out there, that people who did learn from it, but the people that I observed and hired who were the best writers did not study technical writing or get any certificate. I don't even know if any of them ever worked for me. They were usually just smart people with college degrees in other fields, like philosophy or something, and they could write and they could think well, and that was and the most important thing always for me was that they would respond well to what some would call criticism, what I would call feedback. I mean, I hired a woman at Next, whom I think is one of the best writers in the Valley, based on her interview of a musician we were both fond of, no technical writing experience at all. But my test that I would give prospective writers was to critique something they'd written. I didn't care what the field was. So I critiqued her interview, and she was so responsive and never once defensive. That was the most important thing to me. She would say, I see what you're saying. That could be done better. She went on to become, as I said, I think she's one of the best now. And those skills, those aren't things I think you can particularly learn by, I didn't even know I knew there was some kind of certificate you could get, but I guess you're saying that was what the STC was about a lot.
No, not.
Oh.
No, just really, and by the way, I did it, I got into it because you didn't need a degree. I mean, you could do it based on interest and ability.
But you were just saying that was what was happening at the time.
That's the period when
right.
It really professionalized, for better or worse. I would probably say for worse for a lot of it. But I mean, maybe there's other instances. I'm just saying it was, when you started, it was barely even a thing.
Right.
And by the time you started your own business in it, it was already really established.
Right.
I mean, just any thoughts on that evolution? Or maybe you've just given them.
You're asking a big picture question. Well, I mean, I'm really glad that I think it's finally well understood that you need to have people who can program to write developer documentation. I think Apple came to that realization. From what I understand, they have, maybe even still, people that of that nature doing the technical documentation. I think that was part of the evolution that was really important. What else about the evolution of it? I don't know what to say other than I think it's no longer considered a glorified secretarial role. I think we actually have the respect we deserve now. And I think it comes from having, I think over the years, developers especially, not users so much, but developers have come to realize how important it is to have really good documentation. Users don't feel they don't need documentation at all anymore, so that's kind of a dying art. Sad to say.
And for tools, what did you actually use at Apple the first time for documentation? I mean, this is before the laser writer. Were you doing color separations directly, or were you sending that all out? How were you creating Inside Macintosh?
Well, I was using an Apple III, and then there was a production group that took it from there, and there was no color separation. They printed it out in black and white and handed it out, and eventually Addison Wesley published it. So the production was pretty simple. It was mostly just somehow printing it out. I'm not sure how, but I didn't worry about that. I just used the Apple III, and then I switched to the Mac.
And what was develop? What software did you use for develop?
Oh, that's a good question. I can't remember, but I know I did a lot of layout in it. I tweaked every single page.
So you were using like a page layout application?
Yeah, I wonder if it was. I know there was a while there where I used FrameMaker.
Frame was big for a while.
I think that might have been
You
it.
could actually do camera-ready stuff on it.
Yeah, I think that might be what we used. I don't recall.
One question about Next. Was there any connection between your group writing documentation and the developer training group? Like they're teaching classes and how to write Next software?
There never was, not even at Apple, much connection between those two groups, and I think that would have been a good thing. We could have worked closely together and maybe benefited from that, but I think there was always a lot of time pressure, and we didn't have that luxury. It would have been a good idea, but it didn't happen that way.
Do you want to talk about, so then you started your own consultancy, and you still do that now.
Yeah, I have the best boss ever, I like to say. I was actually at first unsure whether I could do it. I had always thought of it hypothetically, but I was unsure, so I spoke to some people who used to work at Apple and had become self-employed, and to other friends, Andy Hertzfeld, I remember specifically, he was very helpful. And to a person, they said, if anyone can do it, you can. I was worried about all I would have to be responsible for, but one of the reasons Luella had hired me to work on Develop was she said it involves making hundreds of decisions for every issue. And I know you can do that. You're very good at making decisions, and that's what being self-employed is all about. There's so much you have to take care of, and you can't dilly-dally over it. You just have to decide, do your accounting and get it done and be on top of it and be on schedule, and that's what I was known for. I had to have other people tell me, you'll stay on top of it, you'll be able to do it, you can do it all, you'll go for it. And Andy was especially supportive. That's why I'm crose at differnet.com, which I always have to spell out for everybody and say, it's not different, it's different from different. he hosted me and just said he was sure I could do it. And so I don't know how it happened, but I was fortunate enough to work with Steve Chernikoff, fabulous writer, on my first 2 jobs were very big. They were for Adobe, and they were upgrading the PostScript reference manual and the PDF reference manual, working side by side with the brilliant, fantastic writer, brilliant programmer Ed Taft of Adobe. I thought, wow, and I was making about what I had been making at Apple, and it was fabulous, and it stayed that way because of all the largely because of all the contacts I had made at Apple when I was the editor of Develop. When they needed a writer, they thought of me. Maybe I solicited work, but I don't recall that ever happening. I recall somehow just word would get out, and I'd be called. So I was always fully employed until I didn't want to be anymore, and I but I'm still working a little bit.
But the list on your LinkedIn, I think, Adobe, Apple, Genentech, which is pretty different.
Yeah, that was fun.
What were you?
Well, I always like learning new things. So this was completely new. And some of it I couldn't understand, but I understood it. I have a way, when you're a technical writer and you're writing about heavily technical things, you develop a skill for understanding stuff just as much as you have to write about it, but no more deeply. And that's what I was doing at Genentech, and they had these long names of drugs, and this wasn't 1,400 pages, but still I would pride myself on being able to tell when they had misspelled the drug name from one page to the next, and they would always say, wow. And I guess I made other good improvements because the people there who were like doctors, and I don't know what, they were in a whole different field, were very happy with my work. But what I remember about the Genentech job, and what I learned about being a contractor, mainly at Genentech I learned this, was that they don't want you to be better than the people they have on staff. At least the people on staff don't want you to be better than them. It causes conflict. And more than once, I was dropped as a contractor for that reason. And which reminds me of my first job at 16, possibly younger, but I think I was around 16, when I worked for my aunt who ran a dress-making business, and I would be belting and snipping and tagging. And I was told by the people who worked there full-time, because I was only working there in the summer, to slow down. And that's what they wanted me to do at Genentech and other places, because I was making them look bad. So they'd get rid of me, but that was okay. I would just go on to another job. That's what I loved about being self-employed and still love, is all the new things you learn. Genentech was very exciting for that reason. And also, I love the fact that quite a few companies by then, this is part of the evolution, now that I think of it, wanted me to write style guides for them, because anything I edit, I insist on, for my own purposes, if not for them, writing at least a style sheet. This is how we're going to spell this word, If nothing else, you have to have kind of a list. So I would make it a style sheet, and then they'd say, we'd like a style guide. And I wrote quite a few style guides, and that would never have happened in the past. No one, because, I don't know, it just wasn't considered enough of a science or an art, or I'm not sure what to call it, but that wasn't considered a thing. And then suddenly it was, and I was asked to write a few. And I love doing that because of my decision-making bent. This is how it's going to be. That's my favorite thing to do, really.
But is it fair to say, Apple documentation was sort of the gold standard in the field. Some of that is because of what Apple did that established a distinct style that requires a guide.
And they have a really good style guide. And I would get some of my ideas. If I didn't know, should I go this way or that way, I'd go to their style guide, and they make it easily available. At least they did. And yeah, I think that's a lot of that was a really good thing that they did to formalize it. And they knew the need was there, but they went really overboard. I mean, not overboard. They did it, and that's the best style guide really I've ever seen.
And then if there's any particular comment, Netscape, Nokia, Rational Software, Sony, Computer, any particular highlights from the Netscape? That must have been of the period. What did you do there?
No, I worked for Netscape because someone that I worked with when I was in tech support doing develop, he went off and went to Netscape, and he was in charge of marketing or something, and he had me write some marketing material for them. As I said, all my connections came from people I already knew from Apple or from when I was working on develop. So there's nothing particular to say about that. I did really like that Marimba wanted a style guide. I really mainly wanted to work for people who...
Kim Polese.
What's that?
Kim Polese, right?
No, I don't know that name. I worked for Craig, somebody there. Yeah, I don't have any anecdotes about any of those companies. I had a long time working for Sony Computing Entertainment America, SCEA. They were great.
Is that the PlayStation group?
Yeah. But no, there's no fun story other than the Genentech getting the long names correct from one page to the next, unpronounceable words. That was fun. But everything else is pretty much what I do. And I just enjoyed it because I would learn something new and get to meet new people. And by then I wasn't quite so introverted anymore. I was able to meet people face to face and live through it.
So for the PlayStation, was that also developer documentation for game developers?
Yeah. And it was tricky because they're based in Japan, and there were a lot of rules you had to follow because of the Japanese influence and how they wanted things done. Yeah, certain ways. But it was okay, and I made a really good friend there, too. Another very persnickety editor became a really good friend. The more persnickety they were, the better we got along.
What about Adam Angst and Tidbits?
Oh, yeah, that was that's still going on in a way.
Oh.
So Adam and Tanya turned over their take control manuals, which I did a lot of editing on. Do you know about that? Their book, they started a book thing on the side from Tidbits. It was connected to it, but it was a separate thing called Take Control. So it'd be take control of whatever it was they were writing about. And so I did that editing.
These are print books.
Well, yeah.
Tidbit is an online magazine.
Right. No, but the Take Control the Take Control were also online.
Okay.
But they were, I don't think they were ever printed. But they knew some really good writers, and these were at the user level and extraordinarily well written, and very much the way I like to see technical writing, which is colloquial. It's very approachable, very easy, enjoyable to read, and yet you learn a lot from it. And so I worked with them for many years as a contract editor, and so I really as I got more and more into my profession, I preferred editing to writing because you could move more quickly from one thing to the next. I never wanted to be stuck too much on one project. And their best writer, in my opinion, Joe Kissel, ended up taking over Take Control. Take Control end of things. Yeah, he took control of Take Control. Take control of Take Control, exactly. Very good.
Steal this book.
I like that. He should have written a book about it. One of the books he wrote was Take Control of Your Thanksgiving Dinner. I love Joe, and he is such a good writer. Incredible. I love editing him because he's so good, and yet he still needs editing. So I'm still working for him. He's one of my 3 remaining clients, and saying I love him. I say that about my last 3 remaining clients. In other words, it's a joy to work with them.
That's why they're your remaining clients.
That's right. Because I just, I didn't have to work anymore, but I thought as long as long as it's not taking too much time away from the rest of my life and I enjoy working with them and they're lovely people to work with, then I will. And Joe is one of them. So I still have a Tidbits connection. But for many, many years I worked for them, and for a while they were paying, this was the only time this ever happened in my tech writing career. They were doing the extraordinary thing of giving you royalties on the books. You didn't get much from royalties, but it motivated you to do a good job. I never needed that kind of motivation, but I thought it was really exciting. And there's quite a few Take Control books now, and thanks to Joe. He writes them, or he gets other people to write them, and I think it's a thriving business, and I have my hand in it still.
And you had met Adam Engst through Develop as well?
Yeah, right around that time. Mm-hmm. Adam and Tanya. And I thought they were really, really good writers. So that's what got my attention. And then somehow when I became self-employed, we established that professional relationship much later than after I started. I can't remember when, but many years we worked together.
And that I found there was an article, you were interviewed like 12 years ago or something. And but you were also working on an iPhone app at the time, or documenting it or something?
Oh yeah, I threw that in. Somebody wrote some auto harp app.
Okay.
A developer I knew from Apple wrote an iPhone app and had me write the user documentation for it, which of course wasn't very much. But I put that in to my resume to show that I could do anything you want.
What did the app do?
Auto harp.
It was an auto harp.
Oh, auto harp.
To play.
Yeah, it was a musical thing. I don't remember the details of it, but it did require a little bit of documentation.
So it was like you blow into the microphone.
Oh,
and
no.
You plug strings on the screen.
I don't remember. It was the beginning of the iPhone days, so it was kind of a long time ago, and I only spent a week on it, but there was no blowing. And I don't think it was even as sophisticated as plucking strings, but it was something, pressing, I don't recall. I'm not even sure why it needed documentation, but it did. So that was fun. I put it down as it was the only thing of that type that I did, and I wanted to make sure people knew that I could still write user doc, and it could be on up-to-date things like the iPhone. In case they didn't know that. I mean, I think a good technical writer can write about really anything.
Now you need to put in something for AI. So shall we do I think I asked already about technical communication evolving. The continuous software development, though, that really changed the process, where you don't have big releases quite the same way in a lot of products. It used to be really driven by the first release and beta, 1.1, 1.2, or whatever.
It was for most of my career, though, because it was that way at Next. And then after that, I didn't work for anyone doing software development anymore. So it was always that way for me. There was always a lot of pressure, and always a lot of, almost always deadline slipping, which was really hard to cope with because we'd have so much pressure from Steve Jobs to get something done by a certain date that wasn't a real date. But it made everybody work really hard, and that was good, I suppose.
What suggestions can you offer to young people, particularly maybe going into a related field, or young women?
Well, certainly if they're going to go into writing technical documentation, developer documentation, they need to learn how to program. Not necessarily the most complicated, imaginable stuff, but just get a feeling for what programming is like and show that you can learn it. And I think a lot of it, too, is psychological. You have to be prepared. Even I, no matter how late in my career it was, would be intimidated by a new project because the software does change so much. And I think there's a psychological aspect to it that you can't become complacent. You have to be very confident in your ability to learn new things. That's one thing I would say to them. And I would also emphasize how important it is to, no matter how good you think you are at it, to accept all feedback with open arms and try to learn from it. I think that's extraordinarily important. It would bother me sometimes that to see, we would send out review copies sometimes to our prospective audience, and they would come back with feedback, and writers would think it wasn't significant, that only one writer had made this comment about something not being really clear, and I would say, well, that's 1 out of 10, so that's 10%. This is eventually going to go out to so many more people, and you don't want all those people to be confused, so you need to redo it. And I also think I don't know how they can know whether they have this or not, but the most important thing, other than some technical knowledge and confidence, is understanding. It sounds crazy, and I don't know how they could know whether they have this skill, but the one thing I found that was missing in a lot of the writers that didn't work out for me was an understanding of going from step A to step B to step C to step D and not skipping any in between. Really seeing that there has to be, it's like logic, and you can't, it's like proving a theorem in geometry. You can't skip anything, and you have to have that ability to sense when you know it, but you didn't write it down. And it has to just all hang together from beginning to end. And the way you find out whether it does or not is you have someone who does have that skill tell you, and you really pay attention to that, and that's where you're going to get your education and become a good technical writer. That doesn't really help them get their foot in the door, which I was once asked when I gave a talk at a school. I think it was aspiring technical writers, and they really wanted to know besides what I just said. I think I said a lot of what I just said was kind of like how to be a good technical writer, but not how to get a job as a technical writer. That's another story, and I have no idea, of course, about that. But I would love to mentor technical writers. I have often thought it would be a great thing to do, and I actually wrote some tests at Next that I would give people that I would hire, because I was so frustrated that you can't tell from an interview how well they're going to work out, and you can't really tell from one writing sample. You have to see if they have that skill that I just mentioned. I would get so many bad drafts, for example, from developers who weren't writers, who were writing for Develop, and I would save the original. This is how I created this test. One of the originals that I thought, okay, well, I think someone even who doesn't know this material inside and out could see that this isn't hanging together. So I had it before and an after, and I would test them on it. So I think somehow those skills need to be picked up, and a mentor would probably be the best way to do it. Not necessarily a course, but someone actually closely watching what you're doing and advising you, and that's how to become better at it. How to get the jobs, though, I can't say. That would be hard.
Anything else you want to?
No, I think I'm good.
And anything you wanted to add, or do you want to speculate about the future? Or
Future?
And for what you just said,
Yeah.
Is there one word that would sum up, like if you could only give one word of advice to a young person?
To sum up?
What you've just been talking about, advice to a young person.
Oh, one word.
What one word of advice would you give to a young person entering tech?
Only one. You got me there. Well, I don't know if one's enough. But I think, I don't know what it'd be. This is an ugly word, mentorship. That's not a good one, but I think that's the most important thing. Confidence. I can't give one. But have no fear. Because it's not as, and yet don't expect it to be too easy. That's more than one word, sorry. I would have had to have been asked that ahead of time and really give it some thought. I'm not a fan. Well, you know.
It works best, you know.
Yeah.
That's pretty good. Fearlessness. What did you say? Anyway.
Yeah. It's not as easy. Some people got into technical writing, and I know this for a fact, because they were writers who wanted to make money. And because they thought it would be easy. An easy way to make money is what I mean. And I would say don't think of it as easy. You'll do a bad job, and hopefully then you wouldn't have the job anymore. I say hopefully because some managers don't even recognize when they're not getting good work out of their writers. It's a problem with managing. You're too far away from it.